When Clara Dawson collapsed in the mud outside Ethan Cole's ranch, her wedding dress torn and her reputation destroyed, she had nothing left but the rain washing away her tears. The widowed cowboy standing over her had buried his wife 6 months prior and watched his daughters forget how to smile. What happened next wasn't a fairy tale. It was survival wrapped in desperation. But sometimes, the broken pieces fit together in ways nobody expects. Stay with me until the end and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story has traveled. The wind that tore across Wyoming territory in October of 1879 carried no mercy. It screamed down from the mountains, stripping leaves from the cottonwoods and rattling the shutters of every cabin and homestead between Cheyenne and the Bighorn Basin. The sky had turned the color of old bruises, swollen purple and black, pregnant with a storm that threatened to break the world open. Clara Dawson had been walking for 3 days. Her feet were bare. The delicate leather shoes she'd worn on what should have been her wedding day long since abandoned on some nameless stretch of road. The white dress, once pristine, once beautiful, hung from her frame in tatters, the hem black with mud and streaked with blood from the thorns she'd pushed through when she left the main road. Her dark hair, which had been pinned up with pearl combs and orange blossoms, now hung in wet ropes down her back, tangled with bits of sage and prairie grass. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten. The town of Bitter Creek lay 2 miles behind her now, and she would never go back there. She'd made the mistake of seeking shelter there the night before, of standing at the door of the boarding house with her hands clasped and her pride swallowed, begging for a room, for just one night, for any corner where she might sleep out of the cold. Mrs. Henderson, the boarding house keeper, had taken one look at Clara's ruined dress and dirt-smudged face and said, "We don't house women of your kind here." "Please," Clara had whispered, "I have nowhere else. I know who you are." The older woman's face had been hard as granite. "Word travels fast. You think I'd let someone like you under my roof? What kind of woman runs out on her wedding? What kind of woman shames a good man at the altar?" She'd leaned closer, her voice dropping to something cruel and satisfied. "Everyone knows what you are, girl. Everyone knows what you did back east before you came here pretending to be respectable." The door had slammed in Clara's face. She'd stood there for a long moment, swaying on her feet, before turning and walking back into the darkness. Behind her, she could hear voices rising in the boarding house, spreading the news. That girl, that Dawson girl, the one who ran, the one with the past. So she walked. She walked because staying meant facing the poison of their words, the violence in their eyes. She walked because somewhere ahead, there had to be a place where people didn't know her name, didn't know the story that had been twisted and reshaped until it bore no resemblance to the truth. She walked because her legs still moved, and as long as they moved, she wasn't dead yet. The rain started as a whisper, cold droplets that kissed her cheeks and shoulders. Within minutes, it became a downpour, a wall of water that turned the world gray and formless. Clara stumbled forward, one foot in front of the other, her vision blurring. The road beneath her feet turned to soup, sucking at her ankles with each step. She didn't see the ranch until she was nearly on top of it. It emerged from the rain like a ghost, a long, low cabin of weathered cedar with a stone chimney, surrounded by split-rail fences that enclosed pastures where horses huddled against the storm. A barn loomed to the left, its doors banging in the wind. Beyond that, she could make out the shapes of outbuildings, a chicken coop, a smokehouse. Clara's knees buckled. She caught herself on a fence post, her fingers white against the wet wood. The warmth of light glowed through the cabin windows, and the sight of it broke something inside her. Warmth, safety. The things she'd been chasing for days, weeks, months, maybe her whole life. Her legs gave out completely. She fell forward into the mud, her hands sinking deep, her face turned up to the rain. She couldn't get up, didn't have the strength. The cold seeped into her bones, and she thought, distantly, that this might be how it ended. Alone. In the mud. 23 years old and already used up. She closed her eyes. Jesus Christ! The voice cut through the rain, rough and male and shocked. Clara tried to lift her head, but her body wouldn't obey. Footsteps splashed toward her, quick and heavy, and then hands were on her shoulders, rolling her over. "Can you hear me?" She forced her eyes open. Through the rain, she saw a man's face, angular and weathered, with deep-set eyes the color of storm clouds and a jaw dark with several days of stubble. He was maybe 35, maybe 40, the kind of man whose age was measured in experience rather than years. A hat sat low on his head, rain pouring from its brim. "Can you hear me?" he repeated, his voice urgent. Clara's lips moved, but no sound came out. The man, the cowboy, she realized, taking in his worn duster and the way he moved with the easy competence of someone who'd spent his life working the land, slid his arms beneath her and lifted her as though she weighed nothing. Clara's head lolled against his chest, and she could hear his heart beating, strong and steady, a counterpoint to the chaos of the storm. "Hold on," he said, though she wasn't sure if he was talking to her or himself. He carried her toward the cabin, moving quickly despite her weight. The door swung open before he reached it, and a child's voice called out, "Papa? Papa? What?" "Get back, Abigail. Get back inside." "But Papa." "Now, girl." The world tilted as he climbed the porch steps. Then warmth surrounded her, sudden and shocking after the cold, and Clara gasped, her lungs expanding. The man laid her down on something soft, a rug maybe, in front of a fireplace, and immediately began stripping off his wet duster. "Abigail, fetch every blanket we have. Quickly." "Who is she?" the child's voice asked, high and frightened. "Don't know yet. Blankets. Move." Small feet pattered away. Clara's eyes fluttered open again, trying to make sense of her surroundings. Firelight danced across wooden beams and simple furniture, a table, chairs. A rocking chair with a basket of mending beside it, everything clean and spare and somehow lonely despite the warmth. The man crouched beside her, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he checked her pulse, touched her forehead. "You're half frozen," he muttered. "How long were you out there?" Clara tried to answer, but all that came out was a croak. "Don't try to talk yet." He looked up as the child, Abigail, came rushing back with an armload of quilts. She was small, maybe 6 years old, with blonde hair in 2 braids and eyes like her father's. Behind her toddled a smaller child, barely more than a baby, clutching a ratty cloth doll. "That's all we have, Papa," Abigail said breathlessly. "Good girl." The man took the blankets and began piling them over Clara, tucking them around her shivering body. "Go put the kettle on, we need hot water." "Is she gonna die?" the little girl asked, her voice small. The man paused, his jaw tightening. "No, not if I can help it." He looked at his daughter and his voice softened. "Do as I said, Abby. Please." The children retreated to what must have been the kitchen area. Clara could hear the clank of an iron kettle, the creak of the water pump. The man stayed beside her, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder. Not familiar, not inappropriate, just anchoring her to the world. "My name's Ethan Cole," he said quietly. "This is my ranch. You're safe here. Understand?" Safe. The word seemed impossible, a concept from another lifetime. Clara's lips formed a single word. "Thank you." His expression shifted, something unreadable passing across his features. "Rest now. We'll talk when you're stronger." The hours that followed existed in a haze of warmth and pain and strange, disconnected moments. Clara surfaced from the cold like a drowning woman breaking through ice. Her body shook violently, uncontrollably, and she heard someone, Ethan, she remembered his name was Ethan, speaking in low, steady tones. The little girl, Abigail, hovered nearby, her small face serious and worried. "Is she going to be all right, Papa?" "She's warming up. That's good." "Why was she outside? Why didn't she have shoes?" "I don't know, honey." "Is she lost?" "Maybe. Or running from something." The child was quiet for a moment. "Like Mama? Was Mama running?" The silence that followed was heavy, weighted with grief that Clara could feel even through her delirium. "No, sweetheart," Ethan finally said, his voice rough. "Not like Mama." At some point, Clara felt warm liquid against her lips. Broth, she realized, rich with salt and fat. She swallowed reflexively, and then again, the warmth spreading through her chest. Strong hands supported her head, tipping the cup carefully. "That's it," Ethan murmured. "Just a little more." She drank until the cup was empty, then sank back into darkness. When she woke again, the light had changed. It was dawn, pale and gray, filtering through windows that looked out on a landscape scrubbed clean by rain. The storm had passed. Clara lay on the floor still, but someone had placed a pillow beneath her head and piled the blanket so high she was cocooned in warmth. The fire crackled softly. Clara turned her head slowly, her muscles protesting every movement. Across the room, in the rocking chair, Ethan Cole sat with his youngest daughter asleep in his arms. The baby, she couldn't have been more than 18 months old, had one thumb in her mouth, her other hand fisted in her father's shirt. Ethan's head was tilted back against the chair, his eyes closed, his face drawn with exhaustion. He'd stayed up all night, watching over her. A stranger. Clara's throat tightened. She tried to sit up, and immediately the world spun. She grabbed for the floor, steadying herself, and the movement must have made a sound because Ethan's eyes snapped open. For a moment he looked confused, disoriented. Then his gaze found her, and he straightened carefully, mindful of the child in his arms. "You're awake," he said, his voice gravelly with lack of sleep. Clara managed a nod. Her voice came out as a rasp. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I'm sorry." "For what?" "For this. For imposing. For—" "You nearly died on my doorstep," Ethan interrupted, his tone matter of fact. "There's nothing to apologize for." He stood slowly, the sleeping baby barely stirring, and carried her to a small bedroom visible through an open door. He laid her in what must have been a crib, covered her with a blanket, and returned, closing the door softly behind him. When he looked at Clara again, his expression was guarded, but not unkind. "Can you stand?" Clara wasn't sure, but she nodded anyway. Pride, foolish, useless pride, made her try. She pushed aside the blankets and got her hands under her, bracing herself. Her arms shook, her legs felt like water. Ethan crossed the room in 3 strides and caught her before she fell, his hands firm on her elbows. "Easy," he said. "You've been through hell. Don't push it." He helped her to the rocking chair, and Clara sank into it gratefully. From this vantage point, she could see the cabin more clearly. The simple furniture, well made but worn. The kitchen area with its cast-iron stove and shelves of tin dishes. The door to what must be another bedroom, this one with 2 small beds visible inside. Everything was clean but stark, functional. Like whoever lived here had forgotten how to make a home feel lived in. Ethan disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a cup of water. Clara took it with trembling hands and drank deeply, the cool liquid soothing her raw throat. "Thank you," she said again. It seemed inadequate, but she didn't have other words. Ethan leaned against the mantel, his arms crossed, studying her with those storm-gray eyes. In the growing daylight, Clara could see him more clearly. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the lean, hard build of a man who worked from dawn to dusk. His face was handsome in a rough-hewn way, all strong bones and sun-weathered skin. But it was his eyes that caught her, old eyes, tired eyes, eyes that had seen too much loss. "You gonna tell me your name?" he asked. Clara hesitated. Her name had become poison, a thing whispered with contempt. But this man had saved her life. He deserved the truth. Clara Dawson. Something flickered in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or just acknowledgement. "Where are you from, Clara Dawson?" "Originally, Boston, but I've been traveling." "Running," he corrected quietly. She flinched. "Yes." "From?" Clara looked down at her hands, at the dirt still embedded under her broken nails, at the scratches that crisscrossed her palms. How did she explain? How did she make him understand without reliving every humiliation, every moment of shame? "For my wedding," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. 3 days ago. I was supposed to marry a man named Gerald Blackwood, a banker from Cheyenne. Respectable. Well-connected. She laughed, a bitter sound. I met him through a matrimonial advertisement. We corresponded for 6 months. When I arrived in Cheyenne, he seemed acceptable. Not kind, exactly, but civil. We set a date. Ethan said nothing, just waited. The night before the wedding, I was staying with his sister. I couldn't sleep, so I went downstairs for water, and I heard them talking. Gerald and two of his friends. They were drunk, celebrating. Her hands tightened around the cup. They were talking about me, about how Gerald had specifically chosen a woman with a questionable past because she'd be grateful, obedient. They laughed about how much they'd paid to dig up information about me from Boston, about how a woman who'd worked as a dance hall girl wouldn't dare make demands or cause trouble. The words hung in the air like smoke. I left that night, Clara continued, took nothing but my dress and shoes. I walked until my feet bled, and then I walked more. I thought if I could get far enough away, maybe I could find somewhere to start over. But every town I stopped in, somehow the story followed, got twisted. By the time I reached Bitter Creek, people were saying I jilted a good man, that I was a con artist, a whore looking for a rich husband to fleece. She looked up at Ethan, expecting disgust, condemnation. Instead, his expression was unreadable. "Were you?" he asked. "A dance hall girl?" "Yes." The word came out defiant. "In Boston, after my father died and left us with nothing. I was 16. My mother was sick, and we needed money for medicine, for food. So I danced. I served drinks. I smiled at men and let them think whatever they wanted to think as long as they tipped well." Her voice hardened. I wasn't a prostitute, but I learned quickly that no one cares about the distinction. The moment you step into a place like that, you're marked. Forever. "Your mother?" "Dead. 2 years ago." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his gaze steady on her face. Then he pushed off from the mantel and crossed to the window, looking out at the morning. "I don't give a damn what you did to survive," he said finally. "You want to know what I see? I see a woman who got dealt a bad hand and played it as best she could. I see someone who had the guts to walk away from a man who would have treated her like property." He turned back to her. "I see someone who damn near killed herself trying to stay alive." Claire's breath caught. Why are you being kind to me?" His mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Maybe because kindness is rare enough that it's worth giving when you can." He moved back toward her, his expression serious. "You need a place to stay, clearly, and He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "I need help here. My wife died 6 months ago, childbed fever, after Rose was born. I've been managing with just Abigail helping, but it's not enough. The house is falling apart. The girls need a woman's touch. A mother." Clara stared at him. "You're asking me to—" "I'm offering you work," Ethan interrupted. "Room and board in exchange for keeping house, cooking, helping with the children. Nothing more. You'd have your own room. You'd be safe. And maybe after a while you could figure out what comes next." "You don't know me," Clara protested. "I could be—" "You could be a lot of things," Ethan agreed, "but you're not a threat. I'm a good judge of character, Miss Dawson, and whatever sins you think you're carrying, they're not the kind that worry me." He held her gaze. "I'm not offering charity. I need the help. My girls need more than I can give them right now. If you want to accept, there's work here for you. If not, I'll take you to the next town when you're strong enough and give you money for a stage. Your choice." Clara's mind reeled. This was impossible. Men didn't offer safe harbor to ruined women. They didn't look past reputations and offer second chances. And yet here was Ethan Cole, a widowed rancher with tired eyes and rough hands, doing exactly that. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you take such a risk?" Ethan's expression softened just for a moment, and she saw the grief that lived beneath his weathered exterior. "Because 6 months ago, I buried my wife, and I've been drowning ever since. Because my daughters deserve better than watching their father barely hold on. Because sometimes, Miss Dawson, broken people are the only ones who know how to help each other." He straightened. "Because you need shelter, and I need a mother for my girls. Seems like a fair trade to me." The words hung between them, pragmatic, unsentimental, honest in a way that cut through all pretense. Clara thought of the road behind her, the endless walking, the doors slammed in her face. She thought of winter coming, of the cold that would kill her if she kept running. She thought of the alternatives, going back to cities where her name was known, trying to disappear into places where women like her ended up in cribs or laudanum dens or shallow graves. Or she could stay here, in this spare, lonely cabin with this grieving man and his two little girls. She could work, she could be useful, she could have a roof and warmth and food, and maybe, just maybe, she could stop running. "I'll stay," she said quietly. "For now, at least, until you find someone better suited." "I'll hold you to that," Ethan replied. Then, as if embarrassed by the weight of the moment, he cleared his throat and gestured toward the bedroom where the baby slept. "Rose will be up soon, and she's a handful. Abigail's the serious one. She'll watch you like a hawk, make sure you're worthy of her papa's trust." Fair warning. Despite everything, Clara felt a smile tug at her lips. "I understand." "Good." Ethan moved toward the door, grabbing a coat from a peg. "I've got to see to the horses and check for storm damage. There's bread and preserves in the kitchen if you're hungry. Make yourself useful if you're up to it, but don't push too hard. You're still recovering." He was almost out the door when Clara called after him. "Mr. Cole?" He paused, looking back. "Thank you for seeing me instead of the stories." Ethan's expression was unreadable. "We've all got stories, Miss Dawson. Most of them don't tell the whole truth." He settled his hat on his head. "Welcome to the ranch." Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Clara sat in the rocking chair, her body aching, her mind spinning. Through the window, she could see Ethan striding toward the barn, his figure strong and purposeful against the pale morning sky. Somewhere in the other room, she heard the baby stirring, making the soft sounds of waking. She was here. She was alive. She was, for the first time in months, maybe years, safe. It wasn't love. It wasn't romance. It was survival, wrapped in a practical arrangement that suited them both. But as Clara pushed herself up from the chair, as she steadied herself and moved toward the kitchen to begin the work that would earn her keep, she felt something unfamiliar bloom in her chest. Hope. The first week passed in a blur of exhaustion and adjustment. Clara threw herself into the work with a desperation born of need. She scrubbed floors until her hands were raw, washed linens in the big copper tub behind the house, beat rugs and swept corners and polished every surface until the cabin gleamed. She cooked simple meals from the stores in the larder, beans and salt pork, biscuits and gravy, stews that simmered all day on the stove. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, the early mornings when Ethan rose before dawn to tend the horses, the evenings when he came in bone-tired and silent. The girls were a different challenge. Rose, at 18 months, was too young to understand anything except that Clara was new and therefore interesting. She toddled after Clara constantly, babbling in her nonsensical baby language, offering her ratty doll for inspection every few minutes. Clara found herself softening toward the child despite her determination to remain detached. It was impossible not to smile when Rose laughed, or to feel a pang of tenderness when the baby fell asleep in her lap, thumb in mouth, completely trusting. Abigail was another matter entirely. The 6-year-old watched Clara with eyes too old for her face, suspicious and guarded. She answered questions with single words, never volunteered information, and made a point of hovering nearby whenever Clara was near her father or sister. She was protecting them, Clara realized, protecting her broken family from another potential loss. It broke Clara's heart. One evening, nearly a week after her arrival, Clara found Abigail sitting on the porch steps, her thin arms wrapped around her knees, staring out at the sunset. The child had been quiet all day, almost sullen, refusing to eat more than a few bites at dinner. Clara hesitated, then sat down beside her, careful to leave space between them. "Beautiful sunset," she offered. Abigail said nothing. "Your father tells me you're a good helper, that you've been taking care of Rose while he works." Still nothing. Clara tried a different approach. "I had a mother once, too. She died when I was not much older than you." That got a reaction. Abigail's head turned slightly, though she didn't look at Clara directly. "She got sick," Clara continued quietly, "and no matter what I did, no matter how hard I tried to help her, she just kept getting worse. I felt like it was my fault. Like if I'd been better, smarter, more useful, maybe she would have stayed." Abigail's voice was small. "Mama died because of Rose." "No," Clara said firmly. "Your mama died because sometimes bodies don't work the way they should, because fevers happen and doctors can't always fix them, not because of Rose, not because of you, not because of anything anyone did wrong. Papa cries at night, Abigail whispered. I hear him. He tries to be quiet, but I hear him. Clara's throat tightened. Grief is like that. Comes when you least expect it. Do you cry for your mama? Sometimes, even after all these years. Abigail finally looked at her, and Clara saw tears tracking down the child's cheeks. I don't want to forget her. I try so hard to remember what she looked like, what she smelled like, but it's getting fuzzy. What if I forget? Clara reached out slowly, giving Abigail time to pull away. When the child didn't move, Clara gently took her hand. You won't forget the important things. The way she made you feel loved. The sound of her voice when she sang to you. Those things live in here. She placed Abigail's hand over her own heart. Where they can't fade. Promise? I promise. Abigail was quiet for a long moment. Then, in a voice barely audible, Are you going to leave too? There it was, the fear beneath the suspicion, the wound that hadn't healed. Clara squeezed her hand gently. I'm not planning to, but I won't lie to you, Abigail. I don't know what the future holds. What I can tell you is this. While I'm here, I'll do my best to take care of you and Rose. I'll cook your meals and mend your clothes and make sure you're safe. I can't replace your mother. I wouldn't even try. But I can be someone you can count on, if you'll let me. Abigail studied her with those two old eyes, weighing Clara's words against her young experience of loss and disappointment. Finally, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. Okay? It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was a start. The break came, as breaks often do, without warning. It was late afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after Clara's arrival. She'd been kneading dough for bread, her hands dusty with flour, when Abigail came running into the cabin, her face pale. Miss Clara, come quick! Clara's heart lurched. What is it? Where's Rose? She's fine. It's Papa. He got kicked by one of the horses. He's bleeding. Clara didn't stop to think. She wiped her hands on her apron and ran. She found Ethan in the paddock, sitting in the dirt with his back against the fence, his left hand pressed to his ribs. Blood seeped between his fingers, staining his shirt dark red. A few feet away, a chestnut stallion snorted and stamped, wild-eyed. "Goddamn horse," Ethan muttered when he saw her. "Spooked at nothing and caught me with his back hoof." "Let me see." Clara dropped to her knees beside him, her hands already reaching for his shirt. "It's not that bad. Let me see." Their eyes met, and something in Clara's expression must have convinced him because Ethan moved his hand away. Clara lifted his shirt carefully, her breath catching at the sight of the wound. The horse's hoof had caught him just below the ribs, tearing through skin and muscle. Blood pulsed steadily from the gash. "Abigail," Clara said, forcing her voice to stay calm. "Run to the house. Bring me clean cloths, the whiskey from the cupboard, and the sewing kit. Quickly now." The girl took off at a run. Clara pressed her own hand to the wound, applying pressure. Ethan hissed through his teeth, but didn't pull away. "When did you become a doctor?" he asked, his voice tight with pain. "I worked in a dance hall, remember? You learn basic field medicine quickly when men get into drunken brawls every Saturday night." She met his eyes. "This needs stitches. Hell, you've had worse? Doesn't make it any more pleasant." Despite the situation, Clara felt her mouth twitch. "No, I suppose it doesn't." Abigail returned, her arms full. Clara took the supplies and set to work. She cleaned the wound with whiskey. Ethan cursed colorfully at that, then threaded a needle with steady hands. "This is going to hurt," she warned. "Just do it." Clara did. To his credit, Ethan didn't flinch as she pushed the needle through his skin, drawing the edges of the wound together with small, careful stitches. His jaw was clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping, and his breathing had gone shallow, but he stayed perfectly still. "You're good at this," he managed after the third stitch. "Practice." Clara didn't look up from her work. "Hold still." "Almost done." When the last stitch was in place, she tied it off and sat back, examining her handiwork. It wasn't pretty, but it was clean and tight. She pressed a clean cloth to the wound, then used strips of fabric to bind his ribs. "Keep this clean. she instructed, her voice crisp and professional. Change the dressing twice a day. If you see any red streaks or if you develop a fever, you need a real doctor. Yes, ma'am. Something in his tone made Clara look up. Ethan was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, surprise, maybe, or reassessment, as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time. What? She asked. Nothing, just thank you. You saved my life, Clara replied simply. Seemed only fair to return the favor. She helped him stand, taking most of his weight as he got his feet under him. He was heavy, solid muscle and bone, and she staggered slightly before finding her balance. Together they made their slow way back to the cabin, Abigail hovering anxiously beside them. Inside, Clara got Ethan settled in his chair by the fire, then checked on Rose, who'd slept through the entire crisis. When she returned to the main room, she found Abigail sitting on the arm of her father's chair, her small hand resting on his shoulder, her face still pale with fear. Is Papa going to die? The child asked. No, Clara said firmly. He's too stubborn for that. Ethan snorted, then winced. Remind me not to laugh for a few days. I'll add it to the list of things you're not allowed to do, Clara replied, along with heavy lifting, horse breaking, and generally being an idiot. Bossy, Ethan observed. Someone has to be. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a kind of understanding, an acknowledgement that the boundaries between them had shifted. Clara was no longer just a woman he'd offered shelter to. She was capable, necessary, someone he could rely on. It should have felt like just another transaction, another practical arrangement. But as Clara turned back to the kitchen, as she heard Abigail's soft voice asking her father if he was really all right, as she felt the strange warmth of being needed, not used, but genuinely needed, she realized that something was changing. The cabin was becoming less lonely, and so, perhaps, was she. That night, after the girls were asleep and Ethan had reluctantly agreed to rest, Clara sat alone by the fire. The day's events had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. When she'd seen Ethan bleeding, had run toward him without hesitation, she'd acted on instinct, the same instinct that had once driven her to work herself to the bone for her dying mother, that had made her walk away from a man who would have owned her. The instinct to protect what mattered. When had Ethan and his daughters started to matter? Clara didn't have an answer. She only knew that somewhere between scrubbing floors and stitching wounds, between Rose's trusting smile and Abigail's tentative acceptance, something had taken root in her chest, something dangerous and terrifying and undeniable. She was beginning to care. The door to Ethan's room opened quietly. He emerged, moving slowly, one hand pressed to his bandaged ribs. When he saw Clara still awake, he paused. Can't sleep? He asked. Neither can you, apparently. He crossed to the fire and lowered himself carefully into the other chair. For a long moment they sat in comfortable silence, watching the flames dance. I was married for 8 years, Ethan finally said, his voice low. Met Catherine when I was 26. She was a preacher's daughter, proper as Sunday morning. Everyone said we were a good match. He was quiet for a beat. They were wrong. Clara looked at him, surprised by the confession. Don't misunderstand, Ethan continued. Catherine was a good woman, kind, dutiful. She gave me 2 beautiful daughters, but we didn't have what you'd call passion. We were partners, comfortable, content. His expression darkened. When she got pregnant with Rose, something changed. She was different, distant, like she knew something the rest of us didn't. Maybe she did, Clara said softly. Maybe. Ethan stared into the fire. After she died, I found letters she'd written but never sent. To her sister back east. She wrote about feeling trapped, about loving Abigail, but feeling like she was drowning, about wanting to be a good mother and wife, but not knowing how to be those things without losing herself. She was struggling, Clara said. It doesn't mean she didn't love you, or the girls. I know. Ethan's voice was rough. But knowing doesn't make the guilt any easier. I should have seen it, should have done something. Clara understood guilt. She'd carried her own version for years. Guilt over her mother's death, over her choices, over every decision that had led her to that ruined wedding dress and that desperate walk through the rain. We can't save people who don't want to be saved, she said quietly. I learned that with my mother. I would have given anything to make her better, but illness doesn't care about love or determination. Sometimes all we can do is be present, bear witness, do our best. Ethan looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw understanding, recognition, the same bone-deep exhaustion that came from trying and failing and trying again anyway. "You're not what I expected," he said. "Neither are you." A smile ghosted across his face. "Good or bad? Haven't decided yet." He laughed, then winced, pressing his hand to his ribs. "Fair enough." They fell back into silence, but it was different now, easier. The kind of quiet that existed between people who'd seen each other's scars and hadn't run away. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Winter was coming early this year, the locals had said. Clara thought of what that would have meant if Ethan hadn't found her, if he hadn't offered shelter. She'd have been dead within weeks. "Thank you," she said suddenly, "for taking a chance on me, for not believing the stories." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was gentle. "Everyone deserves a second chance, Miss Dawson, even broken people like us." "Especially broken people like us," Clara thought. She didn't say it aloud, but she suspected Ethan heard it anyway. They sat by the fire until the logs burned down to embers, two damaged souls learning the careful dance of trust, and somewhere in the darkness, the foundation of something real began to form. Neither of them recognized it yet, but it was there, steady as stone, patient as the Wyoming winter waiting just beyond the walls. Winter arrived with a vengeance that year, sweeping down from the mountains in great white waves that buried the prairie under 3 feet of snow. The temperature plummeted until the air itself seemed to crack with cold, and the wind howled like a living thing, seeking any gap in the cabin's walls to exploit. Clara had never experienced winter like this. Boston winters were harsh, certainly, but nothing compared to the brutal, unforgiving cold of Wyoming. The snow didn't fall so much as a tack, driven horizontal by winds that could knock a grown man off his feet. Ethan spent long hours each day just keeping paths clear between the cabin and the barn, breaking ice on water troughs, ensuring the horses and cattle had shelter and feed. Inside the cabin, Clara created warmth where she could. She baked bread every other day, filling the small space with the yeast-rich smell of rising dough. She kept the stove stoked constantly, a pot of stew or beans always simmering. She sewed curtains from fabric she found in Catherine's old trunk. Ethan had given her permission with a tight-lipped nod and hung them to keep out drafts. She taught Abigail to knit, and together they made socks and mittens while Rose played at their feet, stacking wooden blocks and babbling to her doll. The days fell into rhythm, predictable and almost peaceful. But the town, when they finally had to venture into it, shattered that peace like a rock through ice. It was mid-December when they ran out of supplies that couldn't be stretched further. Sugar, salt, flour, lamp oil, necessities that required a trip to Lewiston, the nearest town, 8 miles south of the ranch. Ethan had delayed as long as possible, but the supplies had dwindled to nothing, and the weather had given them a brief reprieve, 3 days of clear skies and temperatures that climbed almost to freezing. "I'll go alone," Ethan said over breakfast, his tone brooking no argument. "Be faster that way." "The girls and I could use a change of scenery," Clara countered. She'd been inside for nearly 6 weeks straight, and the walls were beginning to press in on her. More than that, she knew that isolation was its own kind of prison. She couldn't hide forever. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Clara, I know what you're worried about," she interrupted, "but I can't spend my whole life avoiding people. If I'm going to stay here, if I'm going to be part of this household, then I need to be able to show my face in town. They'll talk. Let them talk." He studied her across the table, his expression unreadable. Finally, he sighed. "Your choice. But stay close to me. And if anyone gives you trouble, I'll handle it," Clara said firmly. "I've dealt with worse than small-town gossips." That wasn't entirely true, but she kept her voice steady, her chin up. She'd learned early that confidence, even false confidence, could carry you through situations that would otherwise break you. They set out after the breakfast dishes were cleared, bundled in every layer they owned. Ethan drove the wagon, his shoulders hunched against the cold, while Clara sat beside him with Rose in her lap and Abigail pressed close to her other side. The road was treacherous, rutted with frozen mud and hidden ice, But the horses knew their way, and Ethan's hands on the reins were steady and sure. Lewiston emerged from the white landscape like something from a memory. A main street lined with wooden buildings, their false fronts painted in faded colors, their windows frosted over. A church steeple rose at one end, a saloon squatted at the other, and in between were the usual establishments: general store, bank, blacksmith, hotel, boarding house. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, and the few people visible on the street moved quickly, heads down, intent on getting their business done and getting back to warmth. Ethan pulled the wagon up in front of Morrison's general store and set the brake. "I'll get the supplies. You keep the girls warm." "I'm coming in," Clara said. "Clara." "I'm coming in," she repeated, more firmly this time. She handed Rose to Abigail. "You two stay in the wagon under the blankets. We'll be quick." Before Ethan could argue further, she climbed down, her boots crunching in the packed snow. The cold bit through her layers immediately, stealing her breath, but she squared her shoulders and followed Ethan toward the store. The bell above the door jangled as they entered. Heat from a pot-bellied stove hit Clara like a wall, and she blinked, her eyes adjusting to the dimmer light. The store was larger than it had appeared from outside, with shelves packed floor to ceiling with goods, canned foods, bolts of fabric, tools, medicines, ammunition. The smell was a mix of sawdust, coffee, and something sweet, penny candy and jars on the counter. A man stood behind that counter, middle-aged and balding, with wire-rimmed spectacles perched on his nose. He looked up as they entered, and his expression went from welcoming to wary in the space of a heartbeat. "Ethan," he said carefully, "didn't expect to see you in town this time of year." "Needed supplies, Morrison." Ethan's voice was neutral, professional. He pulled a list from his coat pocket and laid it on the counter. "Everything on here if you've got it." Morrison picked up the list, but his eyes kept sliding to Clara. She could see the questions forming, the calculations being made. Who was she? What was she doing with Ethan Cole? Had he heard the stories? "I'll need a few minutes to gather everything," Morrison said slowly. Then, as if unable to help himself, "This your new housekeeper, Ethan?" The question hung in the air, loaded with implication. "This is Miss Dawson," Ethan said flatly. "She's helping with the girls. The list, Morrison." "Right, of course." But Morrison's expression had shifted to something knowing, something smug, and Clara felt her stomach sink. He'd heard. Of course he'd heard. In towns like this, information spread faster than wildfire. Morrison disappeared into the back room to gather supplies, and Clara moved to warm herself by the stove. Through the store's front window, she could see people passing on the street, and more than one stopped to stare at the wagon, at the two small faces peering out from under blankets. The bell jangled again, admitting a gust of cold air and two women in heavy coats and bonnets. They were both middle-aged, well-dressed in the way that signaled money and status in a town like this. They approached the counter, chatting about something inconsequential, until one of them noticed Clara. The conversation stopped dead. "Mrs. Henderson," Ethan said evenly, acknowledging the taller of the two women. "Mrs. Pritchard." "Mr. Cole." Mrs. Henderson's voice was cold enough to match the weather outside. Her eyes raked over Clara with undisguised contempt. "I see you've taken in company." Clara felt every muscle in her body tense, but she kept her expression neutral, her hands folded calmly in front of her. "Miss Dawson is helping with my daughters," Ethan said, his voice hardening. "Not that it's anyone's business but mine." "Oh, I'm sure she's very helpful." Mrs. Henderson's lip curled. "Though I wonder if you're aware of exactly what kind of woman you've invited into your home, into your children's lives." "That's enough," Ethan said sharply. "Is it?" Mrs. Pritchard joined in, her voice shrill with righteous indignation. "The entire town is talking, Mr. Cole. That woman," she pointed at Clara as if she were something distasteful, "abandoned her fiancé at the altar in Cheyenne. Before that, she was working in a Boston dance hall. We all know what that means. And now she's living under your roof, playing house with your innocent children?" Clara found her voice steady despite the rage burning in her chest. "I work for Mr. Cole. I keep his house and care for his daughters. That's all." "Oh, I'm sure," Mrs. Henderson sneered. just like Catherine worked for him before they married. These things have a way of progressing, don't they? Especially with women of your background. You don't know anything about my background, Clara said, her voice low and dangerous. We know enough. We know what you are. The words hit like a slap, but Clara didn't flinch. She'd heard worse, survived worse. These women with their fine clothes and their moral superiority didn't have the power to break her. Not anymore. But before she could respond, Ethan stepped forward, placing himself physically between Clara and the two women. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made both women take a step back. "Let me make something very clear," he said. "Miss Dawson came to my ranch half dead from exposure and starvation. She was running from a man who planned to use her past to control her. Since she arrived, she's worked harder than anyone I've ever seen. She's brought warmth back into a house that was dying of grief. She's given my daughters something I couldn't: stability, care, and yes, love." His gray eyes were hard as stone. "So before you stand there and judge her, before you spread your poison around this town, ask yourselves what you would have done in her position. Ask yourselves if you'd have had half her courage or strength." Mrs. Henderson's face had gone red. "Well, I never—" "No," Ethan interrupted. "You never have. You've never had to choose between survival and dignity. You've never had to walk 8 miles in bare feet because the alternative was worse. You've never had to be brave enough to trust a stranger because you had no other options left." He leaned forward slightly. "Miss Dawson is not your concern. My family is not your concern. And if I hear one more word of gossip about her, from you or anyone else in this town, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly how Christian your charity really is." The silence that followed was absolute. Morrison had returned from the back room and stood frozen, arms full of supplies, staring at the scene unfolding in his store. The two women looked at each other, then back at Ethan, clearly torn between outrage and shock. "You'll regret this," Mrs. Pritchard finally said, her voice trembling. "Defending that woman. You'll see what she really is, and when you do—" "Get out," Ethan said softly. "Both of you." They went, but not before Mrs. Henderson shot Clara one last look of pure venom. The bell jangled violently as they swept out, and through the window Clara could see them hurrying down the street, no doubt already spreading the story of what had happened. The store felt too quiet in their absence. Morrison cleared his throat awkwardly and began piling supplies on the counter. "I'll just get these loaded for you, Ethan." Ethan didn't respond. He turned to Clara, and she saw something in his face that made her throat tighten. Not pity, but fury on her behalf, and underneath that, something that looked almost like respect. "You didn't have to do that," Clara said quietly. "Yes," Ethan replied. "I did. They'll make your life difficult now, you and the girls. Let them try." He picked up a sack of flour and headed for the door. Over his shoulder, he added, "You're not alone in this, Clara. Remember that." Clara stood by the stove, watching him carry supplies out to the wagon, and felt something shift deep in her chest. She'd spent so long believing she had to fight her battles alone that trusting others would only lead to disappointment and pain. But Ethan had just stood in front of a room full of judgment and defended her without hesitation. Not because he owed her, not because he wanted something from her, because it was right, because somehow she'd become someone worth defending. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Abigail sensed the tension and stayed unusually silent, while Rose dozed in Clara's arms, oblivious to the storm they'd left behind. The sky had clouded over again, and new snow began to fall, thick and heavy, blanketing the landscape in fresh white. "They won't let this go," Clara finally said as they turned onto the road leading to the ranch. "I know. It's going to get worse before it gets better." "I know that too." Clara looked at him, at his profile strong and stubborn against the falling snow. "Why did you do it? Why defend me like that? You could have stayed quiet. Let me handle it." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the road ahead. When he spoke, his voice was measured, thoughtful. 6 months ago, when Catherine died, the women of Lewiston descended on the ranch like locusts. They brought casseroles and pity, and every single one of them made it clear they thought I couldn't possibly manage alone. They offered to take the girls, to help me by removing my children from my home. As if grief made me incompetent, as if being a father wasn't enough. His jaw tightened. Mrs. Henderson told me I should send Abigail to live with Catherine's sister back east. Said a girl needed a woman's influence and I was too rough, too uneducated to raise her properly. Clara's hands tightened around Rose. What did you do? Told them all to leave and not come back. Told them my family was my business, and I'd be damned if I'd let them tear us apart just because they couldn't imagine a man raising daughters alone. He glanced at her. So when they came after you today, tried to make you feel small and worthless, I saw the same thing. People who think they have the right to judge, to interfere, to decide what's acceptable. And I won't have it. Not in my life, and not in the lives of people He stopped himself. People under my protection. Clara heard what he didn't say. People he cared about. The realization settled over her like the falling snow, soft and profound. They reached the ranch as the storm intensified, and Ethan drove the wagon straight to the barn. Together they unloaded supplies while the girls hurried into the cabin, and by the time they finished, they were both dusted white with snow, their fingers numb despite gloves. Inside, Clara built up the fire while Ethan put away the supplies, the cabin filled with warmth and the smell of coffee brewing on the stove. Abigail helped Rose out of her winter layers, and for a while they all moved through the familiar routines, the comfort of ordinary tasks. But Clara's mind kept returning to the store, to Mrs. Henderson's hateful words, to the way Ethan had stepped between them without hesitation. She isn't just some woman. She's my wife. He hadn't said those words today, but Clara had heard the echo of them in his defense. The implication that she belonged here, that she was part of this family in more than just a practical sense. It terrified her. That evening, after the girls were in bed, Clara sat at the table with needle and thread, mending one of Ethan's shirts. He sat across from her, cleaning his rifle, the motions automatic and soothing. The fire crackled. The wind howled outside. And between them, the silence was comfortable, companionable. I never thanked you properly, Clara said without looking up from her mending, for what you said today. Don't need thanks? Maybe not, but you have it anyway. She tied off a stitch and reached for the scissors. No one's ever stood up for me like that. Ever. Ethan set down the rifle and met her eyes. Then people have been fools. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, and she looked back down at her work. I'm not used to people seeing me as more than what I've done, more than my mistakes. We're all more than our mistakes, Ethan said quietly. If we weren't, I'd have given up months ago. She looked up at that, curious. What mistakes do you carry? He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, I let Catherine suffer alone. I saw that she was struggling, saw her pulling away, but I convinced myself it was just pregnancy, just exhaustion. I told myself it would get better after the baby came. His voice went rough. Instead, she died. And I'll spend the rest of my life wondering if I could have saved her if I'd just paid more attention. If I'd been less focused on the ranch, on providing, and more focused on her. Clara set down her mending and reached across the table, her hand covering his. His skin was warm, rough, with calluses, solid and real. You can't save someone who doesn't ask for help, she said softly. Believe me, I know. I watched my mother fade away, and no matter how hard I tried, how much I begged her to fight, to hold on, she just let go. Sometimes people are drowning and they don't want to be rescued. Sometimes they're just too tired to swim anymore. Ethan's hand turned under hers, his fingers threading through hers in a grip that was almost desperate. How do you live with it? The guilt? You carry it, Clara said simply. You carry it and you keep moving forward because the alternative is drowning too. You honor them by surviving, by trying to be better, by not letting their deaths be the only thing that defines your life. His thumb traced the back of her hand, a gesture so gentle it made her breath catch. You're stronger than you think you are, Clara Dawson. So are you, Ethan Cole. They sat like that for a long moment, hands joined across the table, two damaged people finding unexpected solace in each other's company. Outside, the storm raged, but inside the cabin held them safe and warm, a fragile sanctuary against the world's judgment. Clara didn't know when things had shifted between them. Didn't know exactly when Ethan had stopped being just her employer and become something more, friend, ally, partner, in the quiet battle of daily survival. But the shift was undeniable, as real as the hand holding hers, and it scared her more than anything she'd faced yet, because caring meant vulnerability, caring meant the possibility of loss, and Clara had lost enough for one lifetime. But as Ethan squeezed her hand gently before releasing it, as he went back to cleaning his rifle and she returned to her mending, Clara realized something profound. Sometimes the risk of loss was worth taking if it meant you didn't have to face the darkness alone. The days that followed the trip to Lewiston were tense. Clara waited for repercussions, for Ethan to face consequences for defending her, but nothing immediate happened. The snow fell steadily, piling higher, cutting them off from town and the rest of the world. It was just the four of them, isolated on the ranch, creating their own small universe. And in that isolation, something beautiful began to grow. Clara noticed it first in small moments. The way Abigail started sitting closer to her during evening reading time, eventually leaning against her shoulder. The way Rose reached for Clara first when she fell and scraped her knee, crying, "Kawa, Kawa," until Clara picked her up and kissed away the tears. The way Ethan's eyes softened when he came in from the cold and found Clara in the kitchen, the smell of fresh bread filling the cabin. She noticed it in her own behavior too, how she automatically set aside the best pieces of meat for Ethan at dinner, knowing he worked hardest and needed the fuel. How she found herself humming while she worked, old songs her mother had taught her. How she no longer flinched at the sound of boots on the porch, no longer calculated escape routes whenever a man entered the room. She was healing. They all were. One afternoon in late December, Clara was teaching Abigail to make sugar cookies, a rare treat saved for Christmas, when the girl looked up at her with serious eyes. "Miss Clara?" "Yes, sweetheart?" "Are you going to stay? After winter?" Clara's hand stilled in the dough. It was a question she'd been avoiding, even in her own mind. The arrangement had been temporary, a practical solution to mutual needs. But somewhere along the way, temporary had started feeling like something else. "Do you want me to stay?" Clara asked carefully. Abigail nodded, her expression solemn. "Rose loves you, and Papa smiles more now. He didn't smile at all after Mama died, but now he does. Not a lot, but some." She paused. "And I like having you here, even though I was mean at first." Clara's throat tightened. She crouched down so she was eye level with the child. "You weren't mean. You were protecting your family. That's brave, not mean. But I was wrong about you." "Maybe a little," Clara admitted with a soft smile. "But you gave me a chance. You let me prove myself. That takes courage, too." "So will you stay?" Clara thought about the question, really considered it. Staying meant more than just physical presence. It meant commitment, investment, allowing herself to become part of this family in truth rather than just in function. It meant risking her heart after years of keeping it locked away and safe. It meant trusting that this time things might be different. "I'd like to," Clara finally said, "if your father agrees, if there's still a place for me here." "There is," Abigail said with the absolute certainty of childhood. "You belong here now." The words hit Clara like a benediction, like absolution for sins she'd never been able to name. You belong here. After years of running, of being cast out and turned away, of existing on the margins of society, someone was telling her she belonged. She pulled Abigail into a hug, holding the thin little body close, and felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, "for letting me be part of your family." Abigail hugged her back fiercely. "You're not part of it. You are it." That night, after the girls were asleep and the cabin had settled into its nighttime quiet, Clara found Ethan on the porch despite the cold. He stood at the railing, looking out at the snow-covered landscape, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "You'll freeze out here," Clara said, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she joined him. "Needed to think." "About?" He glanced at her, his expression difficult to read in the darkness. "About what comes next. About spring." Ah, Clara understood. Spring meant the thaw, the roads opening up, the possibility of change. Spring meant decisions. "The arrangement we made," Ethan continued, his voice careful. "It was supposed to be temporary, help through the winter, until we could find something more permanent." Clara's heart sank. "I see." But that's not what I want anymore, he said quickly. What I'm trying to say, badly, is that I don't want you to leave. The girls need you. He stopped, shook his head. We want you to stay. Permanently, if you're willing. As the housekeeper? As family. Ethan turned to face her fully. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. I know we're not. This isn't a love match. It's practical. But it's also real, Clara. What we've built here these past months, the way the girls have come back to life, the way the house feels like a home again, that's because of you. Clara's chest felt tight. Ethan, let me finish. He took a breath. I'm not going to lie and say I'm in love with you. I don't know if I'm capable of that anymore, not after Catherine. But I respect you. I trust you. I care about your well-being, and I think maybe that's a better foundation than passion that burns out. He held her gaze. So I'm asking, will you stay? Will you let this be your home? Let us be your family? No pretense, no temporary arrangement, real and permanent. Clara looked at him, this rough, honest man who'd saved her life and asked for nothing in return, who'd defended her against the town's judgment, who'd given her a place to heal. She thought about Abigail's fierce hug and Rose's sleepy smile. She thought about the cabin that had become more home in 3 months than anywhere she'd lived in years. She thought about belonging. Yes, she said softly. Yes, I'll stay. Relief washed over Ethan's face, so profound that Clara realized he'd been genuinely worried she'd refuse. He reached out, hesitated, then took her hand in both of his. Thank you, he said simply. They stood together in the cold, hands joined, making a promise that was more binding than any legal document. They were choosing each other, not out of desperation this time, but out of something deeper, mutual respect, trust. The understanding that sometimes family wasn't about blood or grand romance, but about showing up day after day, choosing to stay even when it was hard. We should probably make it official, Ethan said after a moment. Legal, so you'd have protection, rights. So no one could question your place here. Clara understood what he was saying. Marriage, not for love, not for passion, but for security and legitimacy. So the town couldn't tear them apart, couldn't use scandal to take the girls away or drive Clara out. All right, she agreed. When spring comes, we'll make it legal. But even as she said the words, Clara felt something flutter in her chest, something dangerous and hopeful and terrifying. Because the truth was, what she felt for Ethan was no longer just respect or gratitude. Somewhere between mending his shirt and holding his hand, between shared silences and small kindnesses, her heart had betrayed her common sense. She was falling for him. Slowly, carefully, against all her better judgment, and she had no idea if he could ever feel the same. Christmas came quietly. Clara made cookies and roasted a small hen. Ethan rode out to the foothills and came back with an evergreen tree that they decorated with strings of popcorn and paper chains Abigail made. They sang carols around the fire, Ethan's voice surprisingly good, a rich baritone that made Clara's heart ache. And Clara told stories of Christmases past, editing out the painful parts, keeping only the magic for the girls. On Christmas morning, Abigail found a new doll Clara had sewn from scraps, with yellow yarn hair and a dress made from one of Clara's old petticoats. Rose got a wooden horse Ethan had carved, smooth and perfect, painted white with a black mane. And Clara found a package beside her plate at breakfast. A new shawl, soft wool dyed a deep blue, clearly expensive. Ethan, she breathed, you didn't have to. Catherine's sister sent it last year, he said gruffly. Catherine never wore it. Wrong color or something, thought you might like it. But Clara saw the lie in his eyes, saw the way he wouldn't quite meet her gaze. He'd bought it for her. Somehow, probably on that trip to Lewiston, he'd managed to purchase it without her noticing, had saved it for Christmas. The thought made her throat tight. It's beautiful, she said softly. Thank you. Their eyes met across the table, and something passed between them. An acknowledgement, a promise, a question neither was quite ready to ask aloud. The days between Christmas and the New Year were dreamlike, suspended outside of normal time. The snow continued to fall, the world contracted to just the four of them, and Clara let herself imagine that it could always be like this. Safe, warm, almost happy. But on New Year's Eve, as 1879 became 1880, reality came crashing back. They were sitting by the fire, Clara and Ethan in companionable silence while the girls slept, when they heard it. Hoofbeats, fast and urgent, cutting through the quiet night. Ethan was on his feet instantly, his hand going to the rifle above the mantel. "Stay here," he ordered. But Clara followed him to the door, her heart pounding. Visitors at this hour, in this weather, meant trouble. Ethan opened the door to reveal a man on horseback, snow-covered and wild-eyed. It took Clara a moment to recognize him. Tom Brewster, whose ranch lay 5 miles east. "Ethan," Tom gasped. "Thank God you're here. It's my wife. She's having the baby, but something's wrong. She's bleeding, and the baby won't come, and—" His voice broke. "Please. Doc Henderson is snowed in on the other side of the pass. You're the closest help." Ethan's face went white. "Tom, I'm not a doctor. I can't—" "My wife is dying," Tom said flatly. "If you don't come, I'll have to watch her die. And the baby, too." The silence stretched, horrible and suffocating. Then Clara stepped forward. "I'll go." Both men stared at her. "I've assisted with births before," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "In Boston, at the dance hall. Girls got pregnant all the time, and most couldn't afford doctors. I helped where I could." She looked at Ethan. "I'm not a midwife, but I know more than nothing, and right now nothing is what his wife has. Clara, if something goes wrong, then it goes wrong, but at least we tried." She was already moving, grabbing her coat and the shawl he'd given her. "Get your horse saddled, we're going." Ethan looked torn, but he must have seen the determination in her eyes because he nodded sharply. "Tom, go ahead. Keep your wife warm and comfortable. We'll be right behind you." Tom wheeled his horse and took off into the night. "You sure about this?" Ethan asked as he shrugged into his coat. "No," Clara admitted, "but I'm going anyway." They woke Abigail just long enough to tell her they'd be back soon, that she was in charge of Rose, and then they were riding hard through the snow, Ethan's horse straining beneath their combined weight. The cold was vicious, stealing the breath from Clara's lungs, but she held tight to Ethan's waist and focused on what lay ahead. A woman's life. Maybe 2 lives. In her inexperienced hands. The ride to the Brewster Ranch seemed to take hours, though it couldn't have been more than 45 minutes. By the time they arrived, Clara's face was numb with cold, and her fingers could barely grip the reins. Inside the small cabin, chaos. Tom's wife, Mary, lay on a bed in the corner, her face gray with pain and blood loss. She was maybe 25, blonde and usually pretty, but now she looked half dead, her eyes rolling back as another contraction hit. "Oh God," Tom whispered. "Oh God, Mary, please." Clara pushed past him, already stripping off her coat, rolling up her sleeves. She'd seen situations like this before, had assisted with enough difficult births to know the signs of trouble. But knowing and doing were 2 different things, and her hand shook as she approached the bed. "Mary," she said firmly. "Mary, can you hear me?" The woman's eyes focused on her with difficulty. "Who?" "My name is Clara. I'm going to help you, but I need you to stay with me, understand? I need you to fight." Mary nodded weakly. Clara turned to Ethan and Tom. "I need hot water, clean cloths, and whiskey. Now." They scrambled to obey, and Clara turned back to her patient. She examined Mary as gently as she could, her heart sinking at what she found. The baby was breech, positioned wrong, and the bleeding was significant. Without a real doctor, without proper tools, this was going to be touch and go at best. But Clara had survived impossible situations before. She'd clawed her way out of poverty and shame and near death. She could do this. She had to. "All right, Mary," she said, forcing confidence into her voice. "Your baby is turned the wrong way, but we're going to fix that. When the next contraction comes, I need you to push exactly when I tell you. Can you do that?" "I'll try." "You'll do more than try. You'll succeed. Because that baby needs you, and your husband needs you, and I didn't ride through a snowstorm in the middle of the night to let you give up now." A ghost of a smile touched Mary's lips. "Bossy. You have no idea." For the next 3 hours, Clara worked. She guided, pushed, maneuvered, doing everything she'd learned from watching back alley midwives and desperate dance hall girls bring babies into the world, under the worst possible circumstances. Ethan stayed close, following her instructions without question, his presence steady and anchoring. Tom paced, prayed, and eventually collapsed in a chair, his face in his hands. And just when Clara thought they'd lost, just when Mary's eyes started to flutter closed and her breathing went shallow, the baby turned. Clara felt it happen under her hands, felt the shift, and she nearly cried with relief. "Now, Mary, push now." Mary gathered her last reserves of strength and pushed, and with a gush of blood and fluid, the baby slid free into Clara's waiting hands. A girl. Tiny and blue, and completely silent. "No," Clara breathed. "No, no, no." She cleared the baby's mouth and nose, rubbed her chest, her back, doing everything she knew to do. The room held its breath. Tom had stopped pacing. Even Mary, barely conscious, watched with desperate eyes. "Breathe," Clara whispered to the tiny form in her hands. "Please, please breathe." And then, like a miracle, the baby gasped. Once, twice. And then she wailed, thin and reedy, but unmistakably alive. Tom made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. Mary burst into tears. And Clara, hands shaking violently, wrapped the baby in clean cloth and placed her in her mother's arms. "You have a daughter," she said, her voice hoarse. Mary looked up at her, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you. Thank you. You saved us both." Clara couldn't speak. She just nodded and stepped back, letting the family have their moment. Behind her, she felt Ethan's hand on her shoulder, steadying her, and she leaned back into his strength, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. They stayed long enough to ensure Mary and the baby were stable, to clean up the worst of the mess, to accept Tom's stammered thanks and promises of eternal gratitude. Then they rode back through the pre-dawn darkness, silent and bone-tired. The cabin was warm when they returned, Abigail having kept the fire going just as they'd taught her. The girl was asleep in the rocking chair, Rose curled in her lap, both of them safe and sound. Ethan carried them to bed while Clara stood by the fire, staring into the flames, her hands still shaking. When Ethan returned, he found her like that, still in her coat, her dress stained with blood, her eyes distant. "Clara." She looked up at him, and suddenly all the fear she'd held at bay came crashing down. "I could have killed them both. If I'd done one thing wrong. But you didn't." He crossed to her, took her shoulders gently. "You saved them. You were incredible. I was terrified. I know. I was terrified watching you." His voice softened. "But you didn't let it stop you. You did what needed to be done, and you brought that baby back from the edge of death. That's not just skill, Clara. That's courage." Clara looked up at him, and the intensity in his eyes took her breath away. He was looking at her the way no one ever had, with admiration, respect, and something else, something warm and deep and dangerous. "Ethan," she whispered. He cupped her face in his rough hands, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized she was crying. "You're remarkable, you know that?" And then he kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, asking permission, but Clara melted into it, her hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, became something hungry and desperate, weeks of unspoken feelings finally finding expression. His arms came around her, holding her tight, and she let herself be held, let herself be vulnerable in a way she hadn't been since she was a child. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "I'm sorry," he said. "I shouldn't have—" "Don't," Clara interrupted. "Don't apologize. Not for that." He pulled back enough to meet her eyes. "I know I said this was practical. I know I said I couldn't—" "Things change," Clara said softly. "People change. I'm not the same person who collapsed in your yard 3 months ago. And you're not the same man who saved her." "No," Ethan agreed. "We're not." They stood together in the firelight, exhausted and bloody and more honest than they'd ever been. And Clara knew with absolute certainty that whatever this was between them, it was real. It might not be the grand passion of storybooks, but it was steady and true and worth fighting for. And for the first time in her life, Clara wasn't afraid of what came next. She was ready. The kiss changed everything and nothing at all. In the days that followed, life on the ranch continued with the same rhythms. Breakfast before dawn, chores that filled the daylight hours, evenings by the fire with the girls. But underneath the ordinary surface, something fundamental had shifted. Ethan's hand would linger on Clara's shoulder when he passed her in the kitchen. Their eyes would meet across the table, holding for just a beat too long. And at night, after the children slept, they would sit closer together, their conversations deeper, more revealing, peeling back layers they'd both kept hidden for years. They didn't kiss again. Not right away. It was as if both of them understood that what they'd started needed time to grow properly, needed to be tended carefully like the first green shoots pushing through spring soil. Rushing would only damage something that could become beautiful if given patience. News of what Clara had done for Mary Brewster spread faster than the winter wind. Tom rode back to the ranch 3 days after the birth, bringing a ham and his stammered gratitude, and apparently he'd stopped at every homestead between his place and Ethan's to tell the story. Within a week, Clara had become something of a legend. The mystery woman who'd ridden through a blizzard on New Year's Eve and saved both mother and child when the doctor couldn't get through. But their power was waning, their whispers less potent now that Clara had proven herself useful in ways that mattered to frontier life. January gave way to February, and the snow began to lighten. The sun climbed higher each day, promising spring even as the nights remained brutally cold. Ethan started talking about the work that would need doing once the thaw came. Fences to mend, foals to be born, calves to brand. He spoke of the future with an ease that hadn't been there before, as if he could finally see past the grief that had blinded him. Clara found herself drawn into these plans, consulted about decisions, her opinion valued. Should they expand the vegetable garden? Would it make sense to buy chickens for eggs? How many head of cattle could the ranch reasonably support? These were the questions of partners, not employer and hired help, and Clara felt herself settling into the role with surprising comfort. Abigail had stopped calling her Miss Clara and started using just Clara, a small shift that felt monumental. And Rose, now nearly 2 years old, had taken to following Clara everywhere, her tiny hand always reaching for Clara's skirt, her vocabulary expanding daily with words like mama, that she used indiscriminately for both Clara and the mother she'd never known. Each time Rose called her mama, Clara's heart clenched with equal parts joy and fear. She had no right to that title, no claim beyond the practical care she provided. But the child didn't understand such distinctions, and increasingly Clara found she didn't want to correct her. It was Ethan who finally addressed it one evening after the girls had gone to bed. They were sitting by the fire as usual, Clara mending socks while Ethan oiled leather tack, when he said quietly, "Rose called you Mama again today." Clara's hand stilled. "I know. I'm sorry. I should correct her." "No," Ethan interrupted. "That's not what I meant." He set down the harness he'd been working on and looked at her directly. "I meant that it's right. She should call you that. You are her mother in every way that counts." "Ethan, I can't just—" "Why not?" His voice was gentle but firm. "You feed her, clothe her, comfort her when she cries. You sing her to sleep and kiss her scraped knees. You love her. That's what mothers do. The biology doesn't matter." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "What about Catherine? I don't want to erase her." "You're not erasing her. Catherine will always be the woman who gave birth to Rose, who gave me my daughters." "But she's gone, Clara. And you're here. The girls need a mother who's present, who can actually be there for them. That's you." "And you?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you need?" Ethan stood and crossed to where she sat, kneeling beside her chair so their eyes were level. "I need what I've already got. A partner. Someone who understands that life is hard and doesn't need it sugar-coated. Someone who shows up day after day, even when it's difficult." He took her hand. "Someone who makes me remember what it feels like to hope." Clara's breath caught. "Ethan, I'm not good with pretty words," he continued. "I can't promise you romance or grand gestures, but I can promise you honesty. I can promise you that I'll work hard to provide for you and the girls. I can promise that I'll stand between you and anyone who tries to hurt you." He paused. "And I can promise that what I feel for you is real. Maybe it's not the passionate love poets write about, but it's steady, it's true, and it's growing stronger every day." Clara set down her mending with trembling hands and cupped his face, feeling the rough stubble under her palms, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes. "I don't need poetry," she said. "I need exactly what you just described. Honesty, partnership, someone who won't run when things get hard." "I won't run," Ethan said firmly. "That's a promise." "Neither will I." He leaned forward and kissed her, slower than that first desperate kiss on New Year's, but somehow deeper. Clara felt herself falling into him, letting go of the last defenses she'd kept in place. When they finally pulled apart, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "Not in spring like we planned. Now. As soon as we can get to a preacher." Clara's heart hammered. "Why the rush?" "Because I don't want to wait anymore. Because I want everyone to know you're mine. Not my housekeeper, not my hired help, but my wife, my partner, my family." His voice roughened. "Because I'm tired of holding back, of pretending this is just a practical arrangement when we both know it's more than that." Clara thought about all the reasons she should say no, should wait, should be cautious. She thought about her past, her reputation, the ways this could still go wrong. And then she thought about Ethan's steady presence, Abigail's trust, Rose's unconditional love. She thought about belonging, about home, about taking the leap even when the landing wasn't guaranteed. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." Ethan's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, transforming his weathered face into something beautiful. He kissed her again, and this time there was promise in it, a future unfolding between them like a map to undiscovered country. They would have married the very next week if the weather had cooperated. But February had one last storm in store, a howling monster that buried the ranch under 4 feet of fresh snow and made travel impossible for nearly 10 days. They were trapped again, the 4 of them, but this time the isolation felt different, exciting almost, like they were cocooned in their own little world, preparing for a transformation. Clara told the girls one morning over breakfast, unable to keep the secret any longer. "Your father and I have something to tell you," she began, glancing at Ethan for support. He nodded encouragingly, and Clara continued, "We've decided to get married, to make our family official." Abigail's eyes went wide. "You're going to be our real mama?" "If that's all right with you," Clara said carefully. The child launched herself out of her chair and threw her arms around Clara's neck with such force she nearly toppled the both of them. Yes, it's all right. It's more than all right." But Rose, not entirely understanding but picking up on her sister's excitement, began clapping her hands and chanting, "Mama, Mama, Mama." Clara felt tears spill over as she held Abigail close, felt the child's thin body shaking with joy. Over her head, she met Ethan's eyes and saw her own emotion reflected there, gratitude, wonder, and something that looked very much like love. The days waiting for the storm to clear passed in a strange blur of domesticity and anticipation. Clara found herself planning in ways she never had before, thinking about the future with concrete hope rather than vague possibility. She altered one of Catherine's old dresses, a simple blue calico that Ethan had quietly suggested she might wear, taking it in to fit her smaller frame. She taught Abigail how to make a flower crown from dried prairie grass and ribbons, something the girl could wear for the ceremony. And at night, she and Ethan talked about everything: their childhoods, their failures, their fears. Ethan told her about growing up the youngest of 5 brothers, about learning to be tough because gentleness was seen as weakness, about his father dying in a farming accident and his mother following 6 months later from grief, about building the ranch from nothing, proving he could make something of himself despite being written off as the runt. Clara told him about her father, a bookkeeper who'd gambled away everything they had, about her mother's decline from genteel poverty into actual starvation, about the choice, if it could even be called a choice, to work at the dance hall, to smile and flirt and let men think they had a chance while keeping herself just out of reach, about the shame that had followed her ever since, the sense that she'd stained herself permanently. "You survived," Ethan said fiercely when she'd finished. "There's no shame in survival, only in judging people for the choices they had to make." "The world doesn't see it that way." "Then the world's a fool." Clara leaned against him, his arm coming naturally around her shoulders, and felt a peace she hadn't known was possible. For the first time in her life, someone knew the worst of her and stayed anyway. More than stayed, chose her. wanted her, saw value where others had seen only ruin. The storm finally broke on the 9th day, the sun emerging weak but determined. The temperature rose just enough to make travel feasible, and Ethan announced they'd ride to Lewiston the next morning to find the circuit preacher. "What if he won't do it?" Clara asked, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at her. "What if the stories have reached him?" "Then we'll find someone who will," Ethan said simply. "There's more than one preacher in Wyoming territory. We'll keep looking until we find one with sense." But it didn't come to that. Reverend Mitchell, a weathered man in his 60s who'd spent 40 years bringing religion to the frontier, listened to their request with shrewd eyes. He looked at Ethan, then at Clara, then back at Ethan. "I've heard things about you, Miss Dawson," he said bluntly. Clara's heart sank, but she lifted her chin. "I'm sure you have. Most of them are exaggerations, but not all. I've made mistakes. I won't deny my past." "Good," the Reverend said, surprising her, "because I've got no use for liars or pretenders. The frontier's too hard for that nonsense." He turned to Ethan. "You sure about this, son? Taking a woman with a questionable past?" "I'm sure," Ethan said, his voice hard. "And her past isn't questionable. It's proof she's a survivor, that she's strong enough to handle whatever life throws at her. That's exactly the kind of woman I want as my wife." Reverend Mitchell studied them both for a long moment, then nodded. "All right then. When do you want to do this?" "As soon as possible," Ethan said. "Tomorrow afternoon, 2 o'clock. Bring witnesses." They left the Reverend's small house in a daze. Tomorrow. They were getting married tomorrow. Clara felt lightheaded, unmoored, as if the world had tilted on its axis. "You all right?" Ethan asked as they walked back toward the wagon. "I don't know," Clara admitted. "This is happening so fast. We can wait if you need more time." "No." Clara stopped walking and turned to face him. "No, I don't want to wait. I just keep expecting something to go wrong, for someone to stop us, or for you to change your mind, or—" Ethan pulled her close, right there on the street where anyone could see, and kissed her thoroughly. When he released her, his eyes were intense. "Nothing's going wrong," he said. "No one's stopping us, and I'm not changing my mind. Tomorrow, you're going to be my wife, Clara Dawson, and then we're going to go home and live our lives and be happy. Understand?" Clara nodded, feeling something in her chest uncurl and relax. "Understand." They spent that night in the hotel, separate rooms, propriety observed, and Clara lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, unable to quite believe this was real. Tomorrow she would marry Ethan Cole. Tomorrow she would become a wife, a mother, a respected woman with a home and a family. Tomorrow the running would finally, truly end. The ceremony the next day was simple and brief. Tom and Mary Brewster served as witnesses, Mary still pale from childbirth but insistent on attending. Abigail stood beside Clara, solemn in her best dress and flower crown, while Ethan held Rose, who kept trying to eat the ribbon on her bonnet. Reverend Mitchell read from a worn Bible, his voice steady and sure as he spoke the ancient words. Clara barely heard them, too focused on Ethan's hand holding hers, his thumb rubbing gentle circles on her palm. When the Reverend asked if she took this man, her voice rang out clear and strong. "I do." Ethan's "I do" was equally firm, and then the Reverend was pronouncing them husband and wife, and Ethan was kissing her while Abigail cheered and Rose clapped and Mary cried happy tears. Mrs. Clara Cole. That was her name now. Her identity. Her future. They celebrated with dinner at the hotel restaurant, a luxury, but Ethan insisted. Clara sat at the table with her new family, watching Abigail devour her first restaurant meal and Rose smear mashed potatoes everywhere, and felt happiness so profound it was almost painful. "What are you thinking?" Ethan asked quietly. Clara looked at him, this man who'd saved her life in more ways than one. "That I'm the luckiest woman alive." His hand found hers under the table, their fingers lacing together naturally. "Pretty sure I'm the lucky one." They rode home as the sun set, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and rose. Clara sat beside Ethan on the wagon seat, his body warm against hers, and watched their daughters, because they were hers now, legally and truly, doze under blankets in the back. The ranch appeared as the last light faded, the cabin windows glowing with the lamp they'd left burning. Home. Clara's throat tightened at the sight. This was home now. Not just a place she was staying, but where she belonged. Ethan must have felt her emotion because he squeezed her hand. "Welcome home, Mrs. Cole." "Mrs. Cole," Clara repeated, testing the name. "I think I like the sound of that." "Better get used to it. You're stuck with it now." "I can think of worse fates." They got the girls inside and into bed, both children too exhausted from the excitement to resist. Then Ethan and Clara stood in the main room, suddenly awkward with each other. They were married now. The practical barriers were gone, and neither of them quite knew what came next. "I should probably tell you," Ethan began, running a hand through his hair. "I'll understand if you want to keep your own room. I know this marriage is, well, it started as practical, and I don't want you to feel obligated to—" Clara crossed to him and placed a finger on his lips, silencing him. "Ethan, stop talking." He blinked at her. "I married you," Clara said softly. "Not just on paper, but in every way that matters. I want this to be a real marriage, if you do." "I do," Ethan said immediately. "God, Clara, I do. I just didn't want to assume—" She kissed him, and this time there was no hesitation, no holding back. His arms came around her, pulling her close, and Clara felt the last of her defenses crumble. She was safe here, loved here, home. When they finally pulled apart, Ethan's eyes were dark with emotion. "I never thought I'd feel this way again. After Catherine, I thought—" "I know," Clara said. "I thought the same thing, that I was too damaged, too used up to deserve happiness." She smiled up at him. "But maybe we were wrong. Maybe broken people can find wholeness in each other." "Maybe," Ethan agreed, and kissed her again. The weeks that followed were among the happiest of Clara's life. She and Ethan settled into married life with surprising ease, learning each other's rhythms and habits, building something real from the foundation of mutual respect and growing affection. The girls blossomed under the stability of a complete family unit, Abigail becoming more confident and Rose developing a mischievous streak that kept everyone on their toes. But happiness, Claire had learned, was never guaranteed. And in late March, when the thaw had truly begun, and the first green shoots were pushing through the mud, danger came calling. It started with smoke on the horizon. Ethan noticed it first, coming in from checking the fence line. He stood in the doorway, his face grim, staring south toward the Brewster place. "That's too much smoke for a chimney," he said. "Something's burning." Clara came to stand beside him, Rose on her hip, and felt her stomach drop. The smoke was thick and black, rising in a column that could be seen for miles. "Could it be a brush fire?" she asked, knowing even as she spoke that the answer was no. It was too early in the season, the ground still too wet. "It's a structure," Ethan said. "A big one. Barn, maybe." He was already moving, grabbing his coat. "I have to go see if they need help. I'm coming with you." "Clara, don't argue. If it's bad, they'll need every hand. Abigail can watch Rose." Ethan looked torn, but nodded. "All right, but stay back if it's dangerous." They rode hard toward the Brewster Ranch, and as they got closer, Clara's worst fears were confirmed. The barn was fully engulfed, flames reaching 50 feet into the air, the heat visible as a shimmer even from a distance. Tom and 3 ranch hands were running with buckets, trying desperately to wet down the nearby buildings to keep the fire from spreading. Ethan and Clara dismounted and ran to help. The heat was intense, nearly unbearable, and the smoke choked the air. But they formed a bucket line with the others, passing water from the well, throwing it on the stable and chicken coop, fighting to save what they could while the barn burned. It was Mary's scream that changed everything. "The horses! There are still horses in the stable!" Clara's head snapped up. The stable was adjacent to the barn, and flames were already licking at its roof. If the fire spread there, the animals inside would burn alive. Without thinking, Clara dropped her bucket and ran. She heard Ethan shout behind her, heard him calling her name, but she didn't stop. The stable door was closed, and she wrenched it open, immediately hit by a wall of heat and smoke. Inside, 4 horses screamed in terror, rearing and kicking at their stall doors. Clara grabbed a lead rope and ran to the first stall, yanking the door open. The horse inside, a bay mare, bolted past her toward the open door. 2 more followed, wild-eyed with fear, but the 4th, A black gelding that Clara recognized as Tom's favorite was trapped in a back corner stall where the fire had already reached the wall. "Come on," Clara gasped, coughing on smoke. "Come on, boy, you have to move." The horse reared, terrified, and Clara knew she had seconds before the roof collapsed. She grabbed the lead rope attached to the gelding's halter and pulled with all her strength. The horse resisted, and Clara pulled harder, her hands burning where the rope cut into her palms. "Please," she begged, "please, please move." And then Ethan was there, his strong hands joining hers on the rope, his body pressing against her back. Together they pulled, and the gelding finally lurched forward, his hooves clattering on the stable floor. They half led, half dragged the terrified animal toward the door as flames consumed the space where he'd just been standing. They burst out into the open air just as part of the stable roof collapsed with a roar. The gelding jerked free and bolted across the yard, joining the other horses in the far pasture, and Clara fell to her knees, coughing violently, her lungs burning, her hands screaming with pain. Ethan dropped beside her, his hands frantically checking her over. "What the hell were you thinking? You could have died in there." "The horses?" Clara managed between coughs. "To hell with the horses. You could have died, Clara." She looked up at him and saw tears cutting tracks through the soot on his face, saw real fear in his eyes, and understood that his anger came from terror at how close he'd come to losing her. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry, I couldn't let them burn." Ethan pulled her against his chest, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. "Don't ever do that again. Don't you ever risk yourself like that. I can't." His voice broke. "I can't lose you, Clara. I can't." Clara wrapped her arms around him, ignoring the pain in her hands, and held on just as tightly. "I'm here. I'm all right. We're both all right." They stayed like that while the barn finished burning itself out, while the Brewsters and the ranch hands brought the fire under control, while the adrenaline slowly faded and left them shaking. Finally, Mary approached, her face streaked with tears and soot. "Thank you," she said to Clara. "That gelding. Tom's had him since he was a boy. If you hadn't gone in—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Clara looked down at her hands and realized for the first time that they were blistered and bleeding where the rope had burned through her skin. The pain hit all at once, sharp and overwhelming, and she gasped. "Jesus," Ethan breathed, seeing the damage. "Mary, do you have any salve? Bandages?" "In the house. Come on." Inside the Brewster cabin, Mary cleaned and bandaged Clara's hands with gentle efficiency, while Ethan paced like a caged animal, his jaw clenched so tight Clara could hear his teeth grinding. "You'll need to keep these clean," Mary instructed. "Change the bandages daily, and no heavy work for at least a week while they heal." Clara nodded, though she knew that on a ranch there was no such thing as no work. The ride home was silent. Ethan hadn't said a word since they'd left the Brewsters, and Clara could feel his anger rolling off him in waves. Not at her, she realized, at himself. For not being fast enough to stop her. For letting her run into danger. Back at the cabin, Abigail's eyes went wide at the sight of Clara's bandaged hands. "What happened?" "Just a little accident," Clara said, trying to sound casual. "I'm fine." But Ethan's expression said otherwise. After the girls were fed and put to bed, he finally spoke, his voice low and intense. "Do you have any idea what it did to me? Seeing you run into that burning building?" Clara set down the tea she'd been trying to drink despite her bandaged hands. "Ethan, I lost Catherine," he continued, his voice raw. "I watched her die, and there was nothing I could do about it. Nothing. And then you ran into a fire, Clara. You could have died, and it would have been my fault for bringing you there, for not stopping you fast enough. It wasn't your fault. It was my choice. A stupid choice." "Maybe," Clara admitted, "but it was mine to make. Those horses would have died horrible deaths if someone hadn't gone in. I'm sorry I scared you, but I'm not sorry I did it." Ethan stared at her, and she saw him wrestling with conflicting emotions, fear, anger, pride, love. Finally, he crossed to where she sat and knelt in front of her, taking her bandaged hands gently in his. "When I saw that roof starting to collapse," he said quietly, "when I realized you were still inside, I felt my whole world ending, because that's what you are now, Clara. You're my world, you and the girls, and the thought of losing you. He closed his eyes. I can't survive that again. I barely survived it the first time. Clara's throat tightened. You won't lose me. I promise. You can't promise that. No one can. No, she agreed. But I can promise I'll fight like hell to stay. I'll be careful. I won't take stupid risks. She managed a weak smile. Well, I'll try not to. Ethan let out a shaky laugh. That's all I can ask, I suppose. He looked down at her bandaged hands. These are going to hurt like hell for a while. Already do. I'll take care of you. Help with whatever you need. I know you will, just like I'd take care of you. He looked up at her, and in his eyes, Clara saw everything he couldn't quite say out loud. The depth of his feeling, the fear of vulnerability, the wonder that they'd somehow found each other in the midst of all the pain and chaos. I love you, Ethan said suddenly, the words seeming to surprise him as much as they surprised Clara. I didn't think I could feel that way again, didn't think I had it in me. But I do. I love you, Clara, not just for what you do or how you help with the girls. You, the stubborn, brave, impossible woman who runs into burning buildings and saves babies in blizzards and somehow saw something worth staying for in a broken-down widower and his grieving children. Clara felt tears spill over, running hot down her cheeks. I love you too, she whispered. I didn't want to. I tried so hard not to because loving people has always meant losing them. But I couldn't help it. You made me feel safe enough to take the risk. Ethan stood and pulled her carefully to her feet, mindful of her injured hands, and kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart ache. We're going to be all right, he said against her lips. All of us. I promise you that. And standing there in their cabin, with her hands bandaged and her heart full, Clara believed him. They'd both been through too much, survived too many impossible things, to let fear win now. They'd found each other against all odds, built something real from the wreckage of their pasts. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. The next morning, Clara woke to find Ethan already up, standing by the window and looking out at the first real day of spring. The snow had finally melted, leaving the ground muddy and rich. Green was pushing through everywhere. Grass, early wildflowers, the first leaves on the cottonwoods. What are you thinking about? Clara asked, joining him. Catherine, he said quietly. I realized this morning that I haven't thought about her, really thought about her, in weeks, and I felt guilty about that. Clara took his hand carefully, mindful of her bandages. That's not wrong, you know. Moving forward doesn't mean forgetting. I know. Logically, I know. He was quiet for a moment. The truth is, I think I've been holding on to my grief like a penance. Like if I let it go, I'd be betraying her memory. But last night, when I thought I might lose you, I realized something. What? That Catherine would have wanted this. Would have wanted me to find happiness again, to give the girls a real home. She was a good person, Clara. She deserves to be remembered with love, not guilt. He turned to look at her. And you deserve to be loved fully, not as a replacement or a second choice, but as yourself. Clara felt something release in her chest, a tension she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. Thank you for saying that. It's the truth. Ethan pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. We both get a second chance, Clara. Not many people get that. Let's not waste it. No, Clara agreed, looking out at the spring morning, at the new life pushing through the earth, at the future spreading before them like an open road. Let's not. And in that moment, standing in the cabin that had become home, held by the man who'd become her family, Clara finally let go of the last shadows of her past. She'd been running for so long, searching for a place to belong, never believing she'd find it. But here, in this weathered ranch house on the Wyoming prairie, with two little girls sleeping in the next room and a man who loved her despite knowing all her scars, Clara had found something she'd thought impossible. She'd found home. She'd found love. She'd found herself. And she was never letting go. Spring transformed the ranch in ways Clara hadn't imagined possible. The prairie that had seemed so bleak and empty under winter's blanket exploded into life, carpeted with wildflowers in shades of purple, yellow, and white. The air smelled of sage and new grass, and everywhere she looked there was movement. Birds returning from their southern migration, calves wobbling on new legs, foals testing their strength in the pastures. Clara's hands healed slowly, the burns leaving pale scars across her palms that she would carry forever. Ethan had been true to his word, taking over her heavier chores until she could manage them again, and the girls had stepped up in their own ways. Abigail learned to help with the cooking, her small face serious with concentration as she stirred pots and kneaded bread. Even Rose tried to help, though her assistance usually created more work than it saved. The ranch demanded constant attention as winter released its grip. Fences needed mending where the snow had collapsed them. The vegetable garden had to be turned and planted. The barn roof required patching. Ethan worked from before dawn until well after dark most days, and Clara found herself doing the same, her body aching with good exhaustion by the time she fell into bed each night. But there was joy in the work, satisfaction in seeing tangible results. The garden began to sprout neat rows of green. The repaired fences stood straight and strong. The horses grew sleek on spring grass, and the cattle that had looked half dead by winter's end began to fill out again. And through it all, Clara and Ethan continued to build their life together, their marriage deepening from its practical foundations into something neither of them had quite expected. They learned each other's bodies and hearts with equal care, discovering that passion didn't have to be wild and consuming to be real. Sometimes it was Ethan pulling Clara away from her work to dance with her in the kitchen, to no music but their own humming. Sometimes it was Clara braiding wildflowers into his horse's mane just to see him smile. Sometimes it was simply the way their hands found each other across the table, or the comfort of sleeping curled together after a long day. It was in early April, while Clara was working in the garden one morning, that she made the discovery that would change everything. She'd been digging a new bed for herbs near the south side of the cabin when her spade struck something solid. Thinking it was a rock, she dug around it carefully, only to find the corner of a wooden box buried about a foot down. Her curiosity piqued, Clara excavated the box completely and lifted it from the earth. It was cedar, aged but well made, with a simple latch that opened easily despite years in the ground. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. Clara's hands trembled as she lifted them out. The top letter was addressed in a feminine hand, and when she unfolded it carefully, she saw it was dated September 1879, just 2 months after Rose's birth, a month before Catherine's death. The letter began, "My dearest sister Anne." Clara knew she should stop reading, should respect the privacy of the dead, but something compelled her forward. Catherine's words seemed to reach across time, desperate and honest in a way that made Clara's chest ache. "I'm drowning," the letter read. "Everyone looks at me and sees a new mother, blessed and fortunate, but I feel nothing but darkness. The baby cries, and I want to run away. Ethan is kind, but I cannot tell him how deep this pit has become. He would think me ungrateful, unnatural. What kind of mother feels this way about her own child?" The words continued raw and painful, describing Catherine's battle with what Clara recognized as profound despair, what her mother's doctor had once called melancholia, though Clara had heard it called other names. Catherine wrote of feeling disconnected from her own body, of going through the motions of life while feeling already dead inside. She wrote of loving Abigail and Ethan, but being unable to feel that love through the fog that had descended over her. "I'm so tired, Anne," the letter concluded. "So tired of pretending, so tired of fighting. Sometimes I think they would all be better off without me. At least then Ethan could find someone who could be the mother these children deserve, the wife he needs, someone whole and capable and alive in ways I no longer am." The letter was never sent. None of them were. Catherine had written 7 in total, each one more desperate than the last, and then hidden them away. Whether she'd meant to send them eventually, or whether the act of writing had been her only outlet, Clara would never know. She sat in the garden dirt, the letters clutched in her scarred hands, and wept for a woman she'd never met but suddenly understood with painful clarity. Catherine hadn't died just from childbed fever. She died from a sickness of the spirit that the fever had simply made visible, one that had been consuming her slowly for months. And Ethan had never known. Clara found him in the barn, repairing a broken stall door. He looked up at her approach, and his expression immediately shifted from concentration to concern. "What's wrong?" Clara held out the letters wordlessly. Ethan took them, confusion crossing his face, and then recognition as he saw Catherine's handwriting. His hand stilled. "Where did you find these?" "Buried in the garden, near the south wall." Clara's voice was gentle. "I think you need to read them." Ethan looked at the letters as if they were something dangerous, something that might explode if handled wrong. I'm not sure I want to." "I know, but I think you need to." Clara touched his arm. "She was struggling, Ethan, more than anyone realized, and she never told you because she was afraid of what you'd think." His jaw worked, muscles jumping beneath his skin. Finally, he nodded and sank down onto a hay bale, unfolding the first letter with shaking hands. Clara stood nearby, giving him space but remaining present, and watched his face as he read. She saw the moment understanding hit, the way his eyes widened, then squeezed shut, saw the tears that tracked down his weathered cheeks, saw his shoulders begin to shake with silent sobs as the truth of Catherine's suffering became undeniable. When he'd read the last letter, Ethan sat motionless for a long moment, the papers clutched in his fists. Then he looked up at Clara, his face ravaged with grief. "I didn't know," he said hoarsely. "God, Clara, I didn't know. How did I not see it?" Clara knelt in front of him, taking his face in her hands. "Because she hid it. Because women are taught to hide these things, to be grateful and content no matter what they're really feeling, because admitting to that kind of darkness feels like admitting you're broken, wrong, unnatural." "I could have helped her. If she'd just told me." "Could you?" Clara asked gently. "What would you have done? What could anyone have done? There are no doctors who understand this kind of sickness, no medicines to cure it. She would have been told to pray more, to be grateful for her blessings, to simply try harder." Her voice softened further. "She protected you from it, Ethan. She protected the girls. She carried it alone because she thought that was what mothers were supposed to do. She shouldn't have had to carry it alone. No, but she did. And now you know the truth, that she was suffering, that her death might have been a relief from pain we can't comprehend." Clara wiped away his tears with her thumbs. "You can't change what happened, but you can honor her memory by understanding that she did the best she could with what she had, that she loved you and the girls even when she couldn't feel it, that she was brave, even in her darkness." Ethan pulled Clara close, burying his face against her shoulder, and wept as he hadn't allowed himself to weep since Catherine's death. He wept for his lost wife, for her silent suffering, for all the ways he'd failed to see. He wept for the questions that would never be answered and the comfort he'd never been able to offer. And Clara held him through it all, her own tears falling silently, grieving for both of them. When the storm finally passed, Ethan pulled back and looked at the letters again. "What should I do with these?" Clara thought about it. "I think we should bury them. Put them to rest properly with intention. Let Catherine's pain be acknowledged and then released." She paused. "There's a spot in the garden, near where I found them. We could plant something there, something beautiful that blooms every spring." Ethan nodded slowly. "I'd like that." They chose the next morning, when the sun was just breaking over the mountains and the air still held the coolness of night. Clara and Ethan worked together to dig a deeper hole where the box had been buried, while Abigail and Rose watched with solemn faces. Clara had explained, in simple terms appropriate for children, that they'd found letters from their mother and that they were going to give them a special resting place. "Will Mama come back if we plant her letters?" Rose asked, her small face confused. "No, sweetheart," Clara said gently, pulling the child onto her lap. "Your Mama is in heaven, but her memory lives in our hearts, and this garden will help us remember the good parts of her." Abigail, older and wiser, understood more. "Was Mama sad? Is that why she died?" Ethan gathered his daughter close. "Your Mama was sick in a way that was hard to see. And yes, she was sad sometimes. But she loved you very, very much. These letters show how much she wanted to be the best mother she could be, even when it was hard." "I miss her," Abigail whispered. "I know, baby. I miss her too." They placed the letters, still wrapped in their oilcloth, back into the cedar box. Before closing it, Clara added something of her own. a pressed wildflower from the prairie, a symbol of resilience and renewal. Then Ethan closed the box and lowered it into the earth. As they covered it with soil, Ethan spoke quietly, his voice carrying on the morning air. "Catherine, I'm sorry I didn't understand. I'm sorry you felt alone, but I want you to know that the girls are loved and cared for, that we haven't forgotten you, that your struggle wasn't in vain because it taught us to pay attention, to look for the hidden pain, to be kinder than necessary." He paused, his hand finding Clara's. "And I want you to know that I've found someone who brings light back into this house, someone who loves your daughters as fiercely as you did. I hope, wherever you are, that gives you peace." Clara felt tears streaming down her face as she added her own words. "Thank you, Catherine, for giving Ethan and the girls to the world, for fighting as long as you could, for being honest in these letters, even if you couldn't speak the words aloud. Your pain matters. Your struggle matters. And your memory will be honored here." They stood in silence for a moment, the four of them bound together by love and loss, and the complicated truth that families are built on more than just blood or convention. Then Ethan handed Abigail a small bundle of wildflower seeds. "Your mama loved these flowers," he said. "Every spring they'll bloom here and we'll remember her." Abigail scattered the seeds carefully over the disturbed earth, her movements deliberate and reverent. Rose tried to help, mostly just throwing dirt around, but no one corrected her. And when it was done, Clara poured water from a bucket, baptizing the ground, blessing the seeds, marking this place as sacred. In the days that followed, something shifted in the household. It was subtle but profound, like the release of a held breath. Ethan seemed lighter, less burdened by guilt he'd carried for months. He spoke of Catherine more freely now, sharing happy memories with the girls instead of avoiding her name entirely. He hung a small portrait of her in the main room, something he'd kept packed away since her death, and Abigail would sometimes stand before it, talking to her mother in a child's matter-of-fact way. "We planted a garden where your letters were," she told the portrait one evening. "Clara says it's going to be beautiful. I think you'd like it." Clara, overhearing, felt her heart swell. The child was healing, integrating her mother's memory into her present reality rather than being haunted by it. That was all they could ask for. As spring advanced into May, the work on the ranch intensified. This was the season for branding, for moving cattle to summer pastures, for 100 tasks that couldn't be delayed. Tom Brewster and several neighboring ranchers came to help with the branding, and they brought their wives, turning the necessary work into something almost festive. Clara found herself surrounded by women for the first time since arriving in Wyoming, and she braced herself for judgment, for whispers and cold shoulders. But something had changed. The women who arrived at the ranch greeted her with cautious respect, acknowledging her with nods and tentative smiles. Mary Brewster, carrying her daughter in a sling against her chest, pulled Clara aside as the men headed to the corrals. "I wanted to thank you properly," she said, "for what you did, both at the birth and during the fire. Tom says I'd be dead if not for you, and our home would have burned to the ground." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I just did what anyone would do." "No," Mary said firmly. "Most people wouldn't have. Most people would have been too afraid, or too concerned about propriety, or too busy judging to help." She reached out and squeezed Clara's hand. "I know what they said about you. I heard all the stories. But I don't care about your past. I care about who you are now. And who you are is someone brave and kind and exactly what this community needs." Another woman, Mrs. Patterson from a ranch to the west, joined them. She was older, maybe 50, with gray-streaked hair and a no-nonsense manner. "Mary's right," she said bluntly. "We've been short on good people and long on gossips around here. Someone who will actually help instead of just talking about it is worth 10 proper ladies who won't lift a finger." She looked Clara up and down appraisingly. Ethan chose well, better than that pious fool Henderson woman would admit. Clara felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. These women weren't offering friendship exactly, not yet, but they were offering acceptance, a chance to prove herself through actions rather than being condemned for history. It was more than she'd dared hope for. The branding went on for 2 days, hot and dusty work that left everyone exhausted. But at the end of each day, the women gathered in Clara's kitchen, and together they prepared enormous meals for the workers. Clara found herself laughing at their stories, contributing her own, slowly becoming part of the fabric of this community. On the evening of the second day, as the last of the neighbors were preparing to leave, Mrs. Henderson arrived. The cheerful atmosphere in the kitchen died instantly. The other women exchanged glances and Clara felt her stomach drop. She hadn't seen Mrs. Henderson since that confrontation in the general store, and she'd hoped to avoid the woman indefinitely. But Mrs. Henderson didn't come with her usual coterie of judgmental friends. She came alone, and her expression was stiff but not openly hostile. "Mrs. Cole," she said formally, "might I have a word?" Clara straightened her spine and met the woman's eyes. "Of course." They stepped out onto the porch, away from curious ears. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and for a moment neither woman spoke. Finally, Mrs. Henderson cleared her throat. "I owe you an apology." Clara blinked, certain she'd misheard. "I'm sorry?" "An apology," the older woman repeated, the words clearly difficult for her. "I judged you based on gossip and assumptions. I said things that were unkind and unfair, and I've since learned that I was wrong." Clara waited, saying nothing, hardly daring to breathe. "My nephew," Mrs. Henderson continued, her voice tight, "recently found himself in a difficult situation. He made mistakes, as young people do, and the town turned on him with the same viciousness I showed you. Suddenly I understood what it feels like to watch someone you care about be reduced to their worst moments, to have their whole life defined by their failures." She looked Clara in the eye. "I'm not saying we're suddenly friends, but I am saying I was wrong. You've proven yourself to be a woman of character and courage. Ethan Cole is lucky to have you." It wasn't a warm apology. It wasn't even particularly gracious, but it was sincere, and Clara recognized the cost it must have taken for a woman like Mrs. Henderson to admit fault. "Thank you," Clara said quietly. "I appreciate you saying that." Mrs. Henderson nodded once, sharp and businesslike, then turned to leave. But at the edge of the porch, she paused. "The garden you planted," she said without looking back, "where you buried Catherine's letters. It's a lovely tribute. She would have appreciated it." Then she was gone, climbing into her buggy and driving away into the twilight. Clara stood on the porch for a long moment, processing what had just happened. Slowly, cautiously, she allowed herself to believe it. The worst of the town's judgment had lifted. She would never be fully embraced by everyone. Small towns had long memories, but she'd earned enough respect to live without constant condemnation. She was becoming part of this place, part of this community. Not as an outsider to be tolerated, but as someone who belonged. Ethan found her there, still standing in the gathering darkness, and wrapped his arms around her from behind. "Everything all right?" Clara leaned back against his chest. Mrs. Henderson apologized. Did she now? She could hear the smile in his voice. Wonders never cease. "No," Clara agreed. "They don't." They stood together watching the last light fade from the sky, and Clara thought about how far she'd come. From the desperate woman who'd collapsed in the mud to this, a wife, a mother, a respected member of a community. It seemed impossible, like a story someone else had lived. But it was real. The weight of Ethan's arms around her was real. The sound of the girls playing inside the cabin was real. The life they'd built together, messy and imperfect and beautiful, was real. In June, the wildflowers above Catherine's buried letters bloomed in a riot of color. Purple lupine, Indian paintbrush, wild roses, and flowers Clara couldn't name. The girls tended the garden faithfully, watering it during dry spells, pulling weeds, talking to their mother as they worked. One afternoon, Clara found Abigail sitting beside the flowers, her expression thoughtful. The child was 8 now, growing tall and lean like her father, her blonde hair sun-streaked from hours outdoors. "What are you thinking about, sweetheart?" Clara asked, settling beside her. "Mama," Abigail said simply, "I was trying to remember her face, but it's getting harder. I can remember pieces, her smile, the way she sang, but I can't see the whole picture anymore." Clara's heart ached for her. "That's normal. Memory works like that, especially when you're young, but the love doesn't fade, even when the details blur." "I feel bad about it," Abigail admitted, "like I'm betraying her by forgetting." You're not betraying her, you're just growing up. That's what she would have wanted. Clara pulled the girl close. And you have me now to help remember. I can tell you stories about the letters she wrote, about how much she loved you, about how hard she fought to be the best mother she could be. Abigail was quiet for a moment, then asked, Do you think she'd be mad? That you're my mama now? Clara considered the question carefully. I think she'd be grateful. I think she'd want you to have someone who loves you and takes care of you. Someone who helps your papa and makes your house a home. She tilted Abigail's face up to look at her. I'm not trying to replace her, Abby. I'm just trying to be what you need now. Is that okay? Abigail nodded, then threw her arms around Clara's neck. I love you, she whispered fiercely. You're the best mama I could have now. Clara held her tight, tears streaming down her face. I love you too, sweetheart. So much. That evening, as Clara was preparing dinner, she felt a familiar sensation, a flutter low in her belly that she'd been noticing for a few days. At first, she'd dismissed it as digestion, but it had grown more pronounced, more distinct. And suddenly, with absolute certainty, she knew what it was. She was pregnant. Her hand stilled on the bread dough she'd been kneading, and she pressed one palm flat against her stomach. A baby. She was going to have Ethan's baby. The thought was overwhelming, terrifying, and utterly wonderful all at once. She'd wondered, of course. They'd been married for months now, and they shared a bed most nights. But after years of being careful, of avoiding this exact situation, part of her had assumed it simply wouldn't happen. That her body had somehow decided long ago it wasn't meant for motherhood. But here it was. Undeniable. Life growing inside her. Clara didn't tell Ethan immediately. She wanted to be absolutely sure, wanted to watch for other signs. But over the next few days, her certainty grew. Her monthly courses were late, her breasts were tender, and that fluttering continued, small kicks from a presence making itself known. She finally told him one evening after the girls had gone to bed. They were sitting in their usual spots by the fire, and Clara set down her sewing with trembling hands. Ethan, I need to tell you something. He looked up from the harness he was mending, immediately alert to the seriousness in her tone. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. At least, I don't think it is. She took a breath. I'm pregnant. The silence that followed was absolute. Ethan stared at her, his hands frozen in mid-motion, his expression unreadable. Clara felt panic begin to rise. What if he didn't want another child? What if the memory of losing Catherine made this unbearable for him? Then his face broke into a smile so wide and genuine that it transformed him completely. Pregnant, he repeated, as if testing the word. You're sure? Clara nodded. As sure as I can be without a doctor confirming it, but I know my body. It's real, Ethan. He was across the room in 2 strides, pulling her to her feet and into his arms. A baby, he said, his voice thick with emotion. We're going to have a baby. You're not upset? Upset? He pulled back to look at her, his eyes shining. Clara, I can't even find words. After Catherine, I thought I'd never... I have the girls, and that's more than enough, but this... He cupped her face in his hands. A baby that's ours. Together. It feels like proof that we really did get our second chance. Clara felt tears spill over, relief and joy mixing together. I was so afraid you'd be worried after what happened to Catherine. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't scared, Ethan admitted. But I'm not going to let fear steal this joy. We'll be careful. We'll make sure you have the best care. And when the time comes, we'll face it together. He kissed her gently. You're strong, Clara. You're going to be fine. Both of you. They held each other for a long time, swaying slightly, already imagining the child that would join their family, a brother or sister for Abigail and Rose, a new beginning born from the ashes of old pain. When they finally pulled apart, Ethan kept his hand pressed to Clara's still flat stomach, his expression wondering. When do you think? Late winter, maybe. January or February. Clara covered his hand with hers. We should probably wait to tell the girls, until we're certain everything is progressing well. But keeping the secret proved harder than expected. Abigail had always been observant, and she noticed within days that something had changed. She watched Clara with narrow eyes at breakfast one morning, noting how she pushed away the bacon with a slight grimace. "You're not eating," the child observed. "Just not very hungry this morning." "You're never hungry anymore. And you keep touching your stomach." Abigail's eyes widened. "Are you sick, like Mama was?" Clara exchanged a glance with Ethan, who nodded slightly. They'd agreed to tell the truth when asked directly. "No, sweetheart, I'm not sick. I'm pregnant. You're going to have a baby brother or sister." Abigail's mouth fell open. Then she whooped with joy, nearly knocking over her milk in her excitement. "Really? Really, truly?" "Really, truly." Rose, catching her sister's excitement without understanding it, began bouncing in her chair and chanting, "Baby! Baby! Baby!" Abigail jumped up and hugged Clara carefully, as if she might break. "When? How long do we have to wait?" "Several months still. The baby will come in winter." "That's forever away," Ethan laughed, pulling his daughter into his lap. "It'll go faster than you think. And in the meantime, we have plenty to do to get ready." The girls threw themselves into preparations with an enthusiasm that both touched and exhausted Clara. Abigail insisted on sorting through her old baby clothes, washing and mending anything that might be useful. Rose wanted to give the new baby her favorite doll, and no amount of explanation that babies couldn't play with dolls yet would dissuade her. They debated names endlessly, each suggestion more outlandish than the last. "What about Thunder?" Abigail proposed one evening. "That's a good, strong name." "For a horse, maybe," Ethan said diplomatically. "Flower!" Rose shouted. "Baby Flower!" Clara laughed despite her exhaustion. "We have plenty of time to decide. Let's not rush it." As summer advanced toward autumn, Clara's pregnancy became increasingly obvious. Her belly swelled, pressing against her dresses until she had to let them out, and eventually make new ones entirely. Her body ached in new ways, and she tired more easily, but there was also something magical about feeling the baby move inside her, about watching Ethan's face light up each time he felt a kick against his palm. They reinforced the walls of the cabin against winter, stockpiled supplies, prepared as best they could for the months of isolation ahead. And they worked together in Catherine's garden, now officially renamed the Memory Garden, tending the flowers that bloomed above the buried letters. One afternoon in late September, as Clara was harvesting the last of the vegetables before the first frost, she noticed something white half buried in the soil. Curious, she brushed away the dirt to reveal a piece of paper, folded many times and wrapped in waxed cloth. Another letter. But when she opened it, she realized with a start that it wasn't from Catherine. The handwriting was different, masculine, angular. It was dated 3 days after Catherine's funeral, and it was from Ethan. "Catherine," it began, "I don't know if you can hear this wherever you are, but I need to say it anyway. I'm sorry. Sorry I didn't see your suffering. Sorry I wasn't enough to make you want to stay. Sorry that providing for the family meant I was absent when you needed me present." The letter continued, raw with grief and self-recrimination, Ethan flaying himself with guilt. But at the end, he'd written something that made Clara's breath catch. "I promise I'll take care of the girls. I promise I'll tell them about you, about how you loved them even when the darkness made it hard to show. And I promise that if I ever get another chance at love, at partnership, I won't make the same mistakes. I'll pay attention, I'll be present, I'll choose connection over perfection. I hope somehow that brings you peace." Clara sat in the garden holding the letter, understanding that Ethan had buried it just as Catherine had buried hers, seeking some kind of release, some way to process the unbearable. And he'd kept his promises. Every single one. She showed him the letter that evening, and he read it in silence, his jaw working. "I'd forgotten I wrote that," he said finally. "I was out of my mind with grief. The Reverend said writing might help, so I tried. Buried it because looking at the words made it too real." "You've kept your promises," Clara said softly. "All of them." He looked at her, this woman who'd walked into his life broken and desperate and somehow put them both back together. "I'm still keeping them, every day." Clara moved into his arms, their child moving between them, and felt the rightness of this moment. They'd both been shattered by loss, both buried their pain and somehow found each other in the ruins. They'd built something new, not in spite of their scars, but because of them. The memory garden bloomed around them, holding its secrets, its buried grief transformed into beauty. And as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Clara understood that this was what healing looked like. Not the erasure of pain, but the transformation of it into something that could coexist with joy. They stood together in the garden, bound by love and loss and the promise of new life. And Clara knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Home. Autumn painted the Wyoming landscape in shades of amber and rust, the cottonwoods blazing gold against an impossibly blue sky. Clara's belly swelled with the changing season, and she moved through her days with the careful deliberation of a woman carrying precious cargo. The baby was active now, kicking and turning at all hours, making its presence known in ways that both delighted and exhausted her. Ethan had become almost comically protective, hovering whenever she lifted anything heavier than a cup of tea, insisting she rest more than she worked. It would have been suffocating if it hadn't been so clearly born of love and the memory of loss that still haunted him in quiet moments. "I'm not made of glass," Clara told him one afternoon when he'd practically wrestled a bucket of chicken feed out of her hands. "I know that, but indulge me anyway." His hand rested on her belly, feeling the baby kick against his palm. "I can't lose you, Clara, either of you." She softened at the vulnerability in his voice. "You won't. I promise to be careful, but you have to promise not to treat me like an invalid. I need to work. I need to feel useful." They compromised, as they'd learned to do in their months together. Clara handled the lighter chores and let Ethan take on the heavier ones. She cooked and cleaned and tended the girls, but she didn't lift hay bales or haul water from the well. And when exhaustion hit her suddenly, as it often did these days, she allowed herself to rest without guilt. The girls had taken to reading to her baby. Abigail would press her mouth close to Clara's stomach and recite stories she'd memorized, while Rose sang nonsense songs that made everyone laugh. Clara would lie on the bed, propped up with pillows, watching her daughters, because they were hers now, fully and completely, and feel such overwhelming love it sometimes took her breath away. In October, the first real cold snap arrived, bringing with it a reminder of the previous winter, and how much had changed since then. Clara stood at the kitchen window one morning, watching frost patterns melt in the sunrise, and thought about the desperate woman who'd staggered through a storm not quite a year ago. That woman had been hollow, running on nothing but stubborn will and fear. This woman, the one she'd become, was full of love, full of purpose, full of life in the most literal sense. "What are you thinking about?" Ethan asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms carefully around her expanded waist. "About last winter, about how lost I was. And now? Now I'm found." She turned in his arms to face him. "You found me, Ethan, in every way that matters." He kissed her forehead, her nose, her lips. "Pretty sure we found each other." Their peace was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats approaching fast. Ethan tensed immediately, his body shifting into alert readiness. Unexpected visitors were rarely good news on the frontier, especially as winter approached. But when the rider came into view, Clara recognized him as one of the ranch hands from the Patterson spread. The young man pulled his horse to a stop in front of the cabin and swung down, his face tight with urgency. "Mr. Cole, Mrs. Cole, we need help. Mrs. Patterson's daughter went into labor 2 days ago, and the baby won't come. Doc Henderson's been there, but he says there's nothing more he can do. He says—" The boy's voice broke. "He says they're both going to die." Clara felt ice flood her veins. She was 7 months pregnant herself, in no condition to be riding out to assist with a difficult birth. But even as the rational part of her brain cataloged all the reasons she couldn't go, her body was already moving, already reaching for her coat. "Clara, no." Ethan's voice was firm. "You can't, not in your condition, not in your... A woman is dying. Maybe 2 people. And you could be the 3rd if something goes wrong." He gripped her shoulders, his eyes desperate. "I can't let you risk yourself. Not now. Not when we're so close. I'm the only chance they have." Clara's voice was steady, certain. "Doc Henderson is a decent doctor for broken bones and fevers, but he doesn't understand birth the way women do. I've done this before. I can help. You're 7 months pregnant, which means I understand exactly what she's going through." Clara cupped his face in her hands. "I know you're scared. I'm scared too. But I can't let fear stop me from helping when I have the ability." That's not who I am. That's not who you married. Ethan stared at her, conflict warring across his face. Finally, his shoulders sagged in defeat. I'm coming with you. The girls, I'll take them to the Brewsters on the way. Mary can watch them. His voice was hard, brooking no argument. You're not doing this without me there. They made the arrangements quickly. Abigail, old enough to understand the seriousness of the situation, helped pack supplies without being asked. Rose cried at being separated from Clara, clinging to her skirts until Ethan gently pried her away. Mama has to go help someone, sweetheart, Clara said, kneeling with difficulty to be at the child's eye level. But I'll come back. I promise. Promise true? Rose asked, her lip trembling. Promise true. The ride to the Patterson ranch seemed to take forever, every jolt of the wagon sending discomfort through Clara's body. The baby inside her protested the movement, kicking furiously, and she pressed a hand to her side, willing her child to settle. Not yet, she thought. Not now. I need you to wait just a little longer. When they arrived, Clara could hear the screaming before they even entered the house. Mrs. Patterson met them at the door, her face haggard with exhaustion and fear. Thank God you've come. Sarah's been laboring for nearly 3 days now. She's so tired, and the baby... Her voice broke. Doc Henderson says the baby's stuck, that it's too big, positioned wrong. He says there's nothing to be done but wait and pray. Clara moved past her into the house, following the sounds of agony to a bedroom at the back. What she found there made her stomach clench. Sarah Patterson was maybe 19, barely more than a child herself, her face gray with pain and blood loss. Doc Henderson stood beside the bed, his expression grave, and when he saw Clara, something like relief crossed his features. Mrs. Cole, I'd heard you had some experience with difficult births. Some, Clara said, already moving to wash her hands in the basin someone had prepared. Tell me what you know. The doctor explained the situation in clinical terms. The baby was breech and large, Sarah was exhausted beyond the point of being able to push effectively, and he feared that forcing the birth would rupture something internally and kill them both. He'd seen it happen before, he said. Sometimes there were no good options. Claire examined Sarah as gently as she could, feeling for the baby's position, assessing what could be done. The situation was dire, no question, but she'd seen worse in the back rooms of Boston dance halls, had helped girls younger than Sarah survive births that should have killed them. Sarah, she said firmly, capturing the girl's attention, listen to me. I know you're tired. I know you think you can't do this, but you can. Your baby needs you to be strong just a little longer. I can't, Sarah sobbed. I've tried. I can't. Yes, you can. Because I'm going to help you, and we're going to bring this baby into the world together. Clara looked at Doc Henderson. I need you to trust me. What I'm about to do isn't in any medical textbook, but I've seen it work. The doctor hesitated, then nodded. At this point, anything is worth trying. For the next hour, Clara worked. She used techniques she'd learned from an old midwife in Boston, a freed slave woman who'd delivered hundreds of babies and knew tricks that white doctors had never bothered to learn. She had Sarah move into different positions, using gravity to help shift the baby. She massaged Sarah's belly, carefully manipulating the baby into a better position. She spoke constantly, her voice low and steady, anchoring Sarah to the world when pain threatened to pull her under. Ethan stayed close, following Clara's instructions without question, supporting Sarah's weight when Clara needed her upright, holding her hand when the pain became unbearable. And slowly, incrementally, the baby began to move. That's it, Clara breathed. That's it. I can feel it turning. Sarah, when the next contraction comes, you're going to push. Not before, not after. Wait for my signal. The girl nodded weakly, gathering her last reserves of strength. The contraction built, and Clara felt the shift she'd been waiting for. Now, push now. Sarah pushed with everything she had left, and Clara guided the baby, her scarred hands sure and steady despite her own exhaustion. She felt the moment the baby's shoulders cleared, felt the rush of fluid and blood, and then the baby was sliding free into her waiting hands. A boy. Large and perfect and completely silent. Clara's heart stopped. Not again. She couldn't lose another baby, couldn't fail when she was so close. Her hands moved automatically, clearing the baby's airway, stimulating his chest, doing everything she'd done for Mary Brewster's daughter. "Breathe," she whispered. "Please, please breathe." The room held its collective breath. Sarah, barely conscious, watched with desperate eyes. Doc Henderson leaned forward, his expression grim. Ethan's hand found Clara's shoulder, anchoring her. And then the baby coughed, once, twice. And then he was crying, loud and angry and beautifully alive. The sound that went up in the room was part sob, part prayer. Sarah burst into tears of relief and joy. Mrs. Patterson collapsed into a chair, shaking. Doc Henderson wiped his eyes with his sleeve, not bothering to hide his emotion. Clara wrapped the baby in clean cloths and placed him in his mother's arms, then stepped back on legs that suddenly felt like water. The room tilted, and she would have fallen if Ethan hadn't caught her. "I've got you," he murmured. "You did it. You saved them both." Clara leaned into his strength, watching Sarah cradle her son, and felt something give way inside her. She'd been holding herself together through sheer will, ignoring the pain in her back, the tightness in her belly, the exhaustion that went bone deep. But now, with the crisis past, her body was demanding payment for what she'd put it through. "Ethan," she whispered, "I need to sit down." He got her to a chair just as the first real contraction hit. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her stomach, and felt wetness between her legs. Her water had broken. "No," she breathed. "No, it's too early. The baby's not due for 2 more months." "Doc Henderson!" Ethan's voice was sharp with panic. "Clara's in labor." The doctor was at her side in seconds, his hands gentle as he examined her. When he looked up, his expression was serious but not panicked. "The baby's coming," he confirmed. "I'd guess you have a few hours yet, but yes, it's happening." "It's too early," Clara repeated, fear flooding through her. 7 months? Babies don't survive at 7 months. "Some do," Doc Henderson said firmly. "I've seen it happen. Not often, but it's possible." He looked at Ethan. "We need to get her somewhere she can lie down. Is there another room?" Mrs. Patterson, recovered enough to function, led them to her own bedroom. Ethan carried Clara, and she clung to his neck, trying to breathe through the contractions that were already intensifying. "This is my fault," she said through gritted teeth. "I shouldn't have come. I knew it was risky." "Stop," Ethan said fiercely. "You saved 2 lives today. Whatever happens now, that doesn't change. You're a hero, Clara, and you're going to be fine, both of you." But as the hours passed and the labor intensified, Clara wasn't so sure. The pain was different from what she'd expected, sharper, more urgent, as if her body knew something was wrong and was trying to expel the baby quickly. She'd helped other women through labor, but experiencing it herself was something else entirely. It was primal and overwhelming and absolutely terrifying. Ethan stayed with her the whole time, holding her hand, wiping her forehead with cool cloths, whispering encouragement and love. And when the pain became too much, when Clara thought she couldn't endure another moment, he was there, his voice, her anchor. "I'm here. I'm not leaving. You can do this, Clara. You're the strongest person I know." "I'm scared," she sobbed during a brief respite between contractions. "I know, so am I." He pressed his forehead to hers. "But we're doing this together, just like everything else." The baby came just after dawn, tiny and blue and heartbreakingly fragile. Doc Henderson caught her, a girl, Clara registered through the haze of pain and exhaustion, and immediately began working to clear her airway and stimulate breathing. Clara tried to sit up, tried to see, but Ethan held her back. "Let him work," he said, though his voice was tight with fear. The seconds stretched into eternity. The baby remained silent, limp in the doctor's hands, and Clara felt her heart beginning to break. Too early. She'd known it was too early, had known the risks, but she'd gone anyway, and now she was going to pay the price. But then, a sound, weak and thready, barely more than a mule, but unmistakably a cry. "She's breathing," Doc Henderson said, and Clara heard the wonder in his voice. "Small, and she'll need careful watching, but she's breathing." Ethan made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob, and Clara felt tears streaming down her face. The doctor brought the baby to her, this impossibly tiny creature wrapped in soft cloth, and Clara looked down at her daughter's face. She was perfect, so small that Clara could hold her in one hand, her skin translucent and delicate as paper, but perfect. Her eyes were closed, her mouth working reflexively, seeking food. Her fingers were impossibly tiny, nails like little shells. She was alive. Against all odds, she was alive. "Hello, little one," Clara whispered. "Hello, my brave girl." Ethan reached out with one finger and stroked their daughter's cheek, his hand shaking. "She's so small." "But strong," Doc Henderson said. "If she's made it this far, she's a fighter. The next few days will be critical. We need to keep her warm, make sure she's feeding, but I've seen premature babies survive before. It's possible." They named her Hope. It seemed the only appropriate choice for a child who'd come into the world too early but refused to give up. Clara held her constantly those first days, terrified to put her down, afraid that if she lost contact even for a moment, the baby would slip away. Mrs. Patterson turned her house into a hospital, refusing to let them leave until both Clara and the baby were stronger. Sarah, still recovering from her own ordeal, would sit with Clara in the afternoons, and they'd hold their babies together, marveling at the miracle and fragility of new life. "You saved my son," Sarah said one day, "and nearly lost your own daughter doing it." "But I didn't lose her," Clara replied, looking down at Hope's tiny face. "She's here. She's fighting. That's what matters. Still, I owe you everything." Clara thought about that, about debts and gratitude and the complex web of connection that bound communities together. "You don't owe me anything. We help each other. That's what people do." It was 2 weeks before Doc Henderson deemed it safe for them to travel home. Hope had gained weight, her breathing had strengthened, and she was nursing better, though she still had to eat frequently because her stomach was so small. Clara herself had recovered from the birth, though the experience had left her shaken in ways she was still processing. Ethan had sent word to the Brewsters, and when their wagon finally pulled up to the ranch, Abigail and Rose came running out, followed by Mary carrying her daughter. "You came back!" Rose shrieked, launching herself at Clara before anyone could stop her. "You promised true!" Clara caught her awkwardly, mindful of the baby in her arms, and hugged her tight. "I always keep my promises." Abigail approached more carefully, her eyes wide as she looked at the tiny bundle. "Is that the baby?" "This is your sister," Clara said. "Her name is Hope." "She's so little." "Is she supposed to be that little?" "She came early, but she's going to be fine. She just needs time to grow." Abigail reached out and gently touched Hope's hand. The baby's fingers curled reflexively around her sister's finger, and Abigail's face lit up with wonder. "She's holding me!" "She knows your family," Ethan said, his voice rough with emotion. They went inside, and Clara felt something in her chest release. Home. They were home. All of them, safe and together. The cabin that had once felt so empty now brimmed with life. 3 daughters, a husband who loved her, and a future that stretched bright and full of promise. The winter that followed was hard. Hope needed constant care, feeding every 2 hours around the clock. And Clara existed in a fog of exhaustion for weeks. But she was never alone in it. Ethan took shifts with the baby when he could, walking the floor with her in the small hours of the morning, singing off-key lullabies that somehow always soothed her. Abigail helped in countless small ways, fetching clean cloths and warming milk, entertaining Rose so Clara could rest. Even Rose tried to help, bringing her doll to show the baby, covering her with careful kisses. As winter deepened and snow once again buried the ranch, the family turned inward, creating their own warmth against the cold. Ethan would read aloud in the evenings while Clara nursed the baby and the girls sat at her feet. They told stories, sang songs, played games that made everyone laugh, and slowly, Hope grew stronger, gaining weight, her cries becoming louder and more demanding, her eyes focusing with increasing awareness on the faces around her. In January, nearly a year to the day since Clara had first collapsed in the mud outside the ranch, she stood in the doorway watching Ethan teach Abigail to saddle a horse. Rose played nearby, building elaborate structures in the snow that immediately collapsed, causing her to laugh and start over. And in her arms, Hope slept peacefully, finally large enough that Clara wasn't constantly terrified she'd break. Mary Brewster rode up, her son bundled against her chest, and dismounted with practiced ease. "Thought I'd check on you," she said, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. "See how you're managing with the little one." They went inside and sat by the fire while the babies slept, drinking coffee and talking about the mundane challenges of motherhood. It was comfortable, easy. the kind of friendship Clara had never expected to find. "I've been thinking," Mary said after a while, "about what you did, for Sarah and for me. How you risk yourself to help others, even when it costs you." "I just do what needs doing." "It's more than that. You see people, really see them, in ways most folks don't bother with." Mary set down her cup. "I want you to teach me how to help with births, how to handle emergencies. So the next time something happens, you're not the only one who can help." Clara looked at her in surprise. "You want to learn midwifery?" "I want to learn to be useful, like you." Mary's expression was earnest. "We need more women like you out here, Clara. Women who'll get their hands dirty, who aren't afraid to do hard things. Will you teach me?" It was the beginning of something Clara hadn't planned but found herself welcoming. Over the following months, as winter gave way to spring once more, she began teaching Mary what she knew. Other women joined them, Mrs. Patterson's daughter Sarah, a young bride named Emma from a neighboring ranch, even old Mrs. Patterson herself. They met weekly when weather permitted, and Clara shared everything she'd learned about childbirth, healing, the kind of practical medicine that saved lives on the frontier. It gave her purpose beyond her own family, made her part of something larger. And slowly, the reputation that had once branded her as scandalous transformed into something else. She became known as a healer, a teacher, someone the community turned to in times of need. The second spring on the ranch was different from the first. This time, Clara wasn't learning her place. She'd found it. She worked alongside Ethan, making decisions about the ranch's future, planning expansions, dreaming big dreams. The girls thrived, growing tall and strong and confident. And Hope, despite her fragile beginning, developed into a robust baby with a will that matched her name. One afternoon in May, Clara found herself back in the memory garden, tending the flowers that bloomed above the buried letters. The garden had expanded over the year, growing to include not just wildflowers but herbs and roses, a small fountain Ethan had built, benches where the family could sit. Abigail joined her, helping to pull weeds, working in companionable silence for a while before speaking. "I've been thinking about Mama a lot lately," the girl said, "about how she struggled and how she wrote those letters but never sent them." "What about it?" "I want to write her a letter too. Tell her about everything that's happened, about you and Hope, and how happy we are now." Abigail looked up, her expression serious. "Do you think she can hear it, wherever she is?" Clara pulled the girl into a hug. "I think mothers always know when their children are happy. Even if they can't hear the words, they feel the love. So yes, I think she'd like that very much." They sat together in the garden, and Abigail talked, pouring out her heart to the mother she barely remembered. She talked about school lessons and learning to ride, about baby Hope's first smile, about how Clara had taught her to make bread. She talked about missing her mama, but being grateful for the family they'd become. And Clara listened, understanding that this was part of the healing too, acknowledging what was lost while celebrating what had been found. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Clara looked around the table at the faces she loved. Ethan, weathered and strong, meeting her eyes with a smile that still made her heart skip. Abigail, no longer the wary child who'd watched Clara with suspicion, but a confident girl blossoming into something beautiful. Rose, chattering nonsense that somehow made perfect sense, her laughter infectious, and Hope in her cradle nearby, cooing softly. This was her family, hard-won and precious beyond measure, built not on romance or fairy tale promises, but on something more substantial, mutual respect, shared struggle, the daily choice to show up and do the work love required. "What are you thinking about?" Ethan asked, catching her expression. "Just how lucky I am." "We're the lucky ones," he replied, reaching across the table to take her hand. "You walked into our lives when we needed you most. You saved us, Clara, in every way that matters. I think we saved each other." Later, after the children were in bed and the house had settled into quiet, Clara sat at the small desk Ethan had built for her and pulled out a blank sheet of paper. She'd never been much for writing, but something compelled her now. She thought about Catherine's buried letters, about Ethan's note of grief and promise, and she decided to add her own words to the collection, her own piece of this family's history. She wrote about arriving at the ranch broken and desperate, about Ethan's unexpected kindness, about falling in love with him and his daughters without meaning to. She wrote about the fire and Hope's premature birth, and all the moments of fear and joy that had defined her first year as Clara Cole. She wrote about learning that home wasn't a place, but the people who chose to stand with you through darkness and light. When she finished, she read it over once, then folded it carefully and sealed it with wax. In the morning, she would bury it in the memory garden alongside the other letters, adding her story to the soil that nourished new growth. Future generations might find these letters someday, might piece together the complicated truth of how this family was forged from loss and courage and stubborn hope. But that was for later. For now, Clara simply existed in this moment, this peaceful evening in a cabin that had become home, with a husband she loved and children who called her mama. She'd been running for so long, searching for something she couldn't name, and she'd found it here, in the last place she'd expected, with people who saw past her scars to the strength beneath. The years flowed past like the seasons, each one bringing its own challenges and triumphs. Ethan expanded the ranch gradually, buying adjoining land when it became available, building their herd. Clara continued her work with the women of the community, delivering babies and treating illness, becoming someone people trusted with their most vulnerable moments. The girls grew like prairie grass, strong and resilient and beautiful.